You find yourself in a small, dimly lit office, the heavy scent of antiseptic just masking the underlying must of paper and pipe smoke. A physician, dressed in dark wool and starched collar, sits behind a large desk stacked with case files. His hands are stained with ink, not blood, because this doctor writes more than he operates. A knock at the door. In walks a pale, sluggish young woman named Margaret. Her complaint: "I feel tired, doctor. All the time. I struggle to move, to think. My mother says I'm lazy." And so begins a consultation that, in the logic of the day, may lead not to rest or nourishment, but to blistering, cold water treatments, or even an electric jolt to stimulate the nerves. This was Victorian Britain, where the word laziness could earn you a medical diagnosis. Victorian medicine straddled a strange threshold. It was an age of increasing scientific ambition. Microscopes were discovering bacteria, and surgeons were beginning to wash their hands. Yet, at the same time, medicine was deeply rooted in morality. Laziness was not merely a character flaw. It was seen, by many doctors, as a symptom of deeper mental and spiritual decay. The term often appeared in patient records under grander diagnoses like neurasthenia, melancholia, or hysteria. These were all catch-alls for behaviors the middle and upper classes didn't understand or like. For men, being idle was a risk to masculinity and the industrial rhythm of empire. For women, being idle, or even just appearing idle, could be a sign of rebellion. Worse, it suggested an unwillingness to conform to one's God-given domestic role. Victorian society was obsessed with usefulness. Idleness wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Doctors often treated what they called lassitude, sloth, or lethargy as if they were sins rather than symptoms. A working-class man too tired to work might be labeled a malingerer, someone pretending to be ill. A middle-class woman who stayed in bed could be seen as indulging in hysteria. These weren't fringe ideas. Prominent doctors like George Miller Beard, in the US, and Sir James Creighton Brown, in the UK, discussed fatigue syndromes that linked mental illness with social and physical inactivity. They posited that the modern nervous system was overburdened by the demands of civilized life, especially for intellectuals, clerks, and women who were too delicate for factory work but too idle for hard labor. A patient suffering from what we'd now call depression might instead receive a diagnosis of neurasthenia, a disease of the upper class associated with overreading, overstimulation, and moral decay. The treatment? Often, the prescription was to increase exposure to cold, to limit food, to avoid excitement, and, in many cases, to be institutionalized. You might assume that someone considered lazy would be told to rest. But no, Victorian treatments for laziness tended to involve stimulation, even punishment. Here are just a few of the methods. Cold water baths. Patients were submerged in freezing water to shock them into alertness. Some were dunked repeatedly or blasted with jets of cold water in public institutions. Galvanic therapy. Electricity was used to stimulate muscles. Electrodes were attached to the limbs or scalp, sending jolts meant to reawaken the patient's nerves. Blistering. Chemical irritants were applied to create blisters on the skin, under the belief that pain could pull the patient's focus away from their supposed lassitude. Starvation diets. Food was regulated or reduced to prevent indulgence. This was particularly common in women's asylums, where patients were denied rich food under the assumption that gluttony caused weakness. Moral therapy. Some doctors believed that teaching a patient discipline by enforcing routines, chores, or even punishments would cure them of idleness. The paradox here is striking. Laziness was seen as both a sign of mental illness and as a vice requiring correction. As a result, patients were often caught between medical authority and moral judgment, treated as both sick and guilty. While both men and women faced treatment for laziness, women were especially vulnerable. The diagnosis of hysteria, derived from the Greek word for uterus, hystera, became a catch-all for everything from fainting and anxiety to resistance to domestic roles. A woman who withdrew from family life or struggled with fatigue could find herself prescribed rest cures, but not gentle ones. In the famous case of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, her real-life doctor, where Mitchell prescribed complete isolation and forbade her from writing. The result? Near psychological collapse, and later, Her semi-autobiographical short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which criticized this very treatment. For many women, any form of exhaustion, mental, emotional, or physical, was deemed suspicious. If a woman wasn't cheerful, hardworking, and content in her role, something had to be wrong. By the late 1800s, Britain had a booming asylum system. Institutions like the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, also known as Bedlam, and the Holloway Sanatorium were filled with people diagnosed with varying degrees of nervous and moral illnesses. Records from these places reveal an uncomfortable truth. Many of the institutionalized were simply people who didn't, or couldn't, fit the mold. A man who didn't work enough. A woman who didn't clean. A child who didn't focus. Each could be flagged as sluggish and sent for observation, if not outright incarceration. The moral underpinnings of medicine ensured that doctors were not just healers, but judges. In this framework, illness wasn't just something that happened to people. It was something they caused, by weakness of will or poor upbringing. This ideology seeped into public policy, shaping workhouses, poor laws, and schooling. It's easy to dismiss these treatments as cruel or outdated, but they didn't come from nowhere. They were rooted in centuries of belief that health was tied to virtue. In religious traditions across Europe, sloth was one of the 7 deadly sins. It was linked to spiritual decay, temptation, and wastefulness. When modern medicine began to merge with science, it didn't abandon those moral roots, it medicalized them. Thus, the physician became not just a scientist, but a kind of secular priest. The enduring legacy of this thinking remains. Even today, in modern medicine, fatigue and tiredness, particularly in women, are often dismissed or misunderstood. It's probably stress. You just need to move more. You're fine. So we're left with a strange image, a society racing toward industrial modernity, driven by innovation and empire, but stopping to punish those who couldn't keep up. If laziness was a disease in Victorian times, who decided what counted as enough effort? What if the illness wasn't in the patient, but in the demands of the world around them? The sound is constant. Keys rattling, heels striking stone floors, the occasional shuffle of paper or dragging footstep. This is the Wakefield Asylum, one of many sprawling psychiatric institutions that dotted the British countryside in the late 19th century. Rows of iron-framed beds line the walls. Nurses and attendants, stern and starched, move methodically between them. The patients, many of them women, lie still or sit in silence, dressed in plain gowns. Most have no obvious injuries. Their condition, as written on the yellowing admission logs, is mental, moral insanity, melancholia, hysteria, or simply sluggishness. They weren't necessarily violent or unstable. Many were sent here for being tired, withdrawn, or non-compliant with daily life. They were, in the eyes of the state, idle. Victorian asylums were not, as commonly imagined, nightmarish madhouses filled with howling lunatics. They were far more orderly, and that was the point. Beginning in the early 1800s, the British government undertook a major reform of its mental health institutions, seeking to replace the chaos of private madhouses with large public asylums based on strict regiments. The idea was that regularity and structure could restore sanity. Work, in particular, was central. Patients were assigned roles: kitchen duties, sewing, gardening, laundry. Those who were too lazy to work were subject to special supervision or discipline. Dr. John Connolly, one of the leading asylum reformers, famously advocated for the elimination of mechanical restraints, but in their place came routine, repetition, and subtle forms of coercion. Connolly's model emphasized a moral hierarchy where industriousness was equated with mental recovery. In this way, Victorian asylums weren't just places of care. They were factories of compliance. The 19th century introduced a new kind of logic into public life, the logic of the moral economy. Work was not just a means of earning money. It was a measure of one's worth. This was the age of the Industrial Revolution, and time became the most valuable commodity. The ticking of factory clocks, the whistle of the work bell, the precise shift schedules, all of it fostered a belief that productivity equaled virtue. In this moral economy, to be idle was not just inefficient. It was unethical. Government programs like the 1834 Poor Law reinforced this thinking. The new law established workhouses for the poor, Institutions where the undeserving poor, those considered able-bodied but unemployed, would be made to labor under harsh conditions to receive aid. The goal was deterrence. Workhouses were deliberately unpleasant, built on the belief that true need would only be expressed by those desperate enough to accept suffering. If you were tired, sickly, or simply burned out, too bad. If you were not working, you were failing. Let us turn to real historical records for a moment, preserved in county archives and asylum registries across England. Take the case of Henry Cobb, admitted to the Southwell Union Workhouse in 1867. A former farmhand, Cobb had been suffering from fatigue, what he called a heaviness in the limbs. After missing 2 days of work in the fields, his landlord dismissed him. With no family and nowhere to go, Cobb turned to the parish for relief. The response? He was sent to the workhouse and labeled a pauper of no productive value. Inside, he was assigned stone-breaking duty, smashing rocks into road gravel, as part of his daily ration of penance. Then there was Martha Prentice, a domestic servant whose employer cited her for slothful behavior and petitioned the town doctor to have her examined for mental instability. She was 23, underweight, and likely suffering from untreated anemia. But the doctor's note read, prone to fatigue and melancholy, likely to benefit from removal from idle domesticity. She was sent to the asylum at St. Luke's in London. It is worth noting that the actual science of diagnosis during this period was thin. Psychiatry was still in its infancy. Most assessments were subjective, based on observation, social class, and personal bias. Physicians often made sweeping assumptions about a patient's character from posture, eye contact, or tone of voice. A quiet woman might be seen as depressed, a tired man as malingering. Poverty, illiteracy, or unusual speech patterns could raise suspicions of deviance. And the terms themselves, neurasthenia, melancholia, moral idiocy, were rarely defined in consistent medical terms. They were social diagnoses as much as medical ones. This meant that people without any clear illness could still be confined, institutionalized, or punished. All it took was a neighbor's complaint, a landlord's frustration, or a doctor's judgment that someone was unwilling rather than unwell. Women, again, bore the brunt of this system. Medical textbooks of the time openly described women as constitutionally more vulnerable to mental disorder. Their reproductive systems, it was claimed, made them hysterical, irrational, and prone to nervous decline. A woman who did not fulfill her expected domestic role, wife, mother, caretaker, risked being labeled as emotionally or mentally deficient. Some of the symptoms recorded in women's asylum entries were sleeps during the day, reluctant to sew, dislikes housework, talks back to mother. The treatment often included rigid schedules, forced work therapy, and isolation from family. Many never left. Once inside the asylum system, even improved behavior was viewed with suspicion. Obedience was considered a symptom of manipulation unless verified by repeated observation. One patient, Elizabeth Parker, was institutionalized for sleepiness and apathy. Her case file includes the tragic note, has ceased to protest. Considered improving. Why such fear of laziness? In a rapidly industrializing society, the idle person was not just an inconvenience. They were a drag on the system. The whole machine depended on punctuality, regularity, and physical stamina. Trains had to run on time. Factories could not tolerate delay. Shops had to be stocked and staffed. But perhaps more importantly, the idle were feared because they seemed to reject the moral order. To rest too long, to disengage from labor, was to opt out of the economic contract, and that frightened employers, politicians, even family members. There was also a racialized and class-based dimension. The idle rich were romanticized. Victorian novels are full of lounging aristocrats, while the idle poor were demonized. Wealth shielded the privileged from diagnosis. Fatigue in a nobleman was ennui. In a scullery maid, it was moral decay. One of the most paradoxical treatments of the era was the so-called rest cure, popularized by American physician S. Were Mitchell but adopted widely in Britain. It was most commonly prescribed to middle and upper-class women showing signs of fatigue, melancholia, or nervousness. But the rest cure was far from restful. Patients were confined to bed, often for weeks or months. They were denied reading, writing, visitors, and even conversation. Milk-based diets were enforced to limit overstimulation of the organs. Some were force-fed when they resisted. The idea was to reduce sensory input and enforce total passivity, to reset the nerves. But the cure often induced mental deterioration. Patients became listless, anxious, even delusional. Modern psychologists now view the treatment as a form of sensory deprivation. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who famously underwent the rest cure, described it as a descent into madness, and used her experience as the basis for the yellow wallpaper, a haunting tale of a woman driven insane by enforced idleness. The cure, ironically, pathologized the very thing it enforced: inactivity. Not everyone accepted their fate. In hidden ways, many patients resisted. Some feigned cooperation to earn early release. Others hid writing materials, composed letters in secret, or created artwork and embroidery as a form of covert self-expression. In rare cases, family members intervened, demanding release or exposing institutional abuses in local papers. Reformers began to take notice. By the end of the 19th century, voices began to rise, not loud, but persistent, questioning the institutional obsession with work, routine, and moral judgment. Still, for thousands of patients labeled as lazy, history offered no reprieve. Their stories remained locked in asylum records, their lives forgotten as minor footnotes in the greater narrative of empire and progress. We often imagine progress as a straight path, from ignorance to enlightenment. But the story of Victorian treatment for laziness suggests otherwise. Beneath the white coats and moral reform was a powerful fear that someone, somewhere, might stop working. What if the real sickness was not sloth, but a society that refused to let people rest? You're looking out of a narrow-paned window in a small town outside Manchester. The landscape is gray, the moors misted, and the view distant. Inside, the sanatorium is quiet. A woman sits in a wooden chair beside the fire, unmoving. Her name is Beatrice, and she has been here for 4 years. The original diagnosis? General nervous exhaustion, prone to indolence. Now, her hair has turned white. Her medical chart is routine: no fevers, no delusions, no physical injury. Only the ongoing observation that she does not contribute. Beatrice is one of the many forgotten patients of the Victorian age, not mad, not criminal, not diseased. Just tired, just still. As the 20th century loomed, the British Empire was still expanding, still industrializing, still demanding. The workday grew longer, cities more crowded, and life more mechanized. But alongside these developments came something strange: a growing population of people who simply couldn't keep up. Middle-class workers collapsed from what newspapers called nervous breakdowns. Children fainted in schoolrooms. Women withdrew from family life. Factory workers became sluggish and irritable. Soldiers reported unexplained fatigue. Something was happening. Doctors had a dozen names for it: neurasthenia, chlorosis, nervous weakness, melancholia. But behind the names was a common reality: exhaustion. Profound, unshakable exhaustion. What made this new was not that people were tired, but that they were being blamed for it. Victorian society viewed tiredness not as a warning sign, but as a personal flaw. To be tired was to lack stamina, willpower, and discipline. It wasn't uncommon for medical texts to describe fatigue in moralistic terms. In an 1892 article from The Lancet, a physician wrote, "Fatigue without cause is often the badge of the degenerate. Where vigor ought to dwell, we instead find spiritual weakness and avoidance of responsibility." This perspective infiltrated schools, factories, homes. Teachers kept watch for students who slouched. Factory managers disciplined workers for droopiness. Mothers were advised to deny their daughters rest so as not to spoil their constitution. Even progressive physicians often failed to question the cultural forces at play. Fatigue was framed as deviance, a refusal to adapt, rather than a sign that adaptation was impossible. But change was on the horizon. By the 1890s, medical researchers began investigating the nervous system in earnest. Advances in neurology, psychology, and physiology began to challenge the moral model of fatigue. In Germany, Wilhelm Erb and others began linking symptoms of exhaustion to specific neural conditions. In France, Jean-Martin Charcot studied the effects of trauma on the body and mind, particularly in relation to hysteria and physical collapse. Sigmund Freud, then still early in his career, began writing about suppressed emotion as a source of somatic illness. In Britain, some doctors, such as Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi, began calling out the sexist pseudoscience behind diagnoses like hysteria and female laziness. Her 1877 paper, The Question of Rest for Women During Menstruation, argued, based on data, that women's cycles did not impair their cognitive or physical function. It was a landmark moment in the medicalization of fatigue. These developments laid the groundwork for new understandings of mental health. But reform was slow. As late as 1900, many British physicians still wrote about the lazy temperament in reference to patients with no diagnosed physical illness. One of the most haunting elements of this history is the silence of the patients. Most did not leave behind diaries or interviews. Their thoughts were mediated through doctors' notes, asylum records, or family complaints. Yet a few rare voices emerge. In 1898, a woman named Clara Bowden smuggled pages of a diary from the Holloway Sanatorium. Her writings, later discovered in an attic in Surrey, describe her days under the diagnosis of feebleness. She wrote, "Each morning they expect me to rise and sew, but I feel my limbs filled with lead. It is not that I will not move. It is that I cannot. But when I say this, they record it as defiance. And later, they call it laziness. I call it grief." Clara's experience, though exceptional in its record, was not unique. For thousands of others, their only illness was being unable to perform their role in a machine that never stopped. Much of the medical focus in the Victorian period was on the middle and upper classes, those who could afford treatment or were considered worth saving. But the working poor faced their own forms of institutional scrutiny. Miners suffering from fatigue were dismissed as shirking. Servants who collapsed in hot kitchens were deemed insolent. Even children laboring in textile mills were beaten for slowness. When these laborers did enter hospitals or infirmaries, their complaints were rarely recorded in full. Many were simply prescribed stimulants, told to eat less, or pushed back into work. A 1902 hospital report from Leeds describes a patient, aged 15, listed as low vitality, poor work ethic. No blood work was done. No treatment prescribed. There was, in essence, no room in Victorian society for those who couldn't endure the grind. The system had no language for burnout, only blame. It's important to remember that the British Empire was not only a military and economic enterprise, it was a cultural one. The values of industriousness, discipline, and stoicism were exported across colonies as marks of civilization. As a result, the diagnosis of laziness extended beyond Britain's shores. In India, British physicians wrote of native apathy and treated locals as prone to indolence due to climatic softness. In Africa, colonial officers described tribal groups as inherently lazy and unfit for modern work rhythms. In the Caribbean, plantation economies labeled emancipated people as sluggish and unreliable. These narratives weren't medical in any scientific sense. They were tools of control. By labeling colonized people as lazy, imperialists justified forced labor, missionary correction, and economic coercion. The same moral economy that punished tired Britons was exported to millions of others around the globe. Despite the harshness of the era, seeds of change were planted. Charity organizations like the Society for the Relief of Distress began to argue that many people labeled as idle were actually sick or injured. Christian reformers advocated for rest homes for the poor. A few progressive physicians began to call for shorter workdays and better nutrition. The first disability pensions for mental health conditions began to appear in the early 1900s. And by 1914, the outbreak of World War I would completely change the conversation. The war introduced a new diagnosis, shell shock. Suddenly, young, strong men, soldiers, patriots, were collapsing from invisible illness. They were shaking, unable to speak, catatonic with fatigue. No one could accuse them of laziness. They had been to the front lines. In the wake of this, old notions of sloth began to erode. The link between mental trauma and physical fatigue was now undeniable. The moral judgment began to give way to clinical inquiry. Even so, the legacy of Victorian attitudes remains. The idea that fatigue equals weakness still lingers in medical systems, in workplaces, in schools. Many modern diagnoses, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, long COVID, continue to face skepticism. Patients are often told it's all in your head or advised to exercise more despite systemic exhaustion. Women, particularly, still report that their symptoms are dismissed more frequently than men's. The ghosts of neurasthenia and hysteria are still with us. And yet, we've also inherited a counter-tradition, one of resistance, reform, and recognition. The path from Clara Bowden's diary to today's mental health advocacy may be long, but it is traceable. Close your eyes and picture a tired woman in 1893, sitting alone in a sanatorium bed. Her hands rest on her lap. Outside the window, the sky is gray. A nurse enters, makes a note in a book, and moves on. Now picture someone today, sitting at a desk late into the night, eyes blurry, body aching, still answering emails. A notification buzzes. Another shift begins. The diagnosis has changed. The setting is modern, but the story remains familiar. How many people, even now, are still punished, quietly, daily, for the crime of being tired? It's before sunrise in a townhouse in Spitalfields, London. In the gloom of the basement, the air is already thick with coal smoke and damp linen. Somewhere above, the family still sleeps. But below, a girl in a gray apron is grinding her knuckles into a soapstone floor, scrubbing the last of yesterday's soot. She is 17. Her name is Eliza. She has not yet had tea, but she has already boiled 3 kettles of it for others. This is domestic service in the 18th century. Early mornings, endless repetition, and constant proximity to a luxury you're never allowed to enjoy. Tea, the fashionable marker of refinement and leisure, became a symbol of status in the grand houses of Georgian Britain. But for the people who prepared it, the servants who stoked the fires, washed the china, dusted the caddies, and brewed the leaves, it was an instrument of control. By the mid-1700s, tea drinking had transformed from an exotic novelty to a domestic ritual. Once limited to the elite, tea became increasingly accessible to the middle classes, but remained loaded with symbolism. To own a tea set was to signal civility, discipline, and proper taste. More than just a drink, tea was part of a performative ritual. Drawing rooms were arranged around its consumption. Special tables were made. Lockable tea caddies were kept under the mistress's watchful eye. Every step of the tea-making process, from boiling the water to steeping the leaves, was laden with expectations. But someone had to do the labor. That labor fell to domestic servants, most of them women, many of them barely out of childhood. By 1770, 1 in every 5 households in London employed at least one servant. In larger homes, entire hierarchies of domestic workers existed: footmen, kitchen maids, scullery maids, chambermaids, and more. The division of labor was strict, and the margin for error slim. Servants were expected to be invisible, but always available. Their duties began well before the household rose, and often ended long after its members had gone to bed. Days were broken into dozens of discrete, repetitive tasks: lighting fires, polishing boots, laundering clothes, and preparing meals. In middle-class homes, the maid of all work, like Eliza, was responsible for nearly everything. She was cook, cleaner, nurse, and errand girl in one. And her first duty, every morning, was the fire. Boiling water for tea was a delicate process. It required gathering coal, lighting the hearth, cleaning the kettle, filling it from the hand pump, and standing watch to prevent overboiling. All this before the mistress of the house even sat up in bed. Tea was not just precious, it was protected. A pound of tea in 1760 could cost the equivalent of a week's wages for a servant. With heavy taxes levied on imports, genuine tea was a luxury good, and counterfeit tea a common problem. Leaves were sometimes adulterated with ash, iron filings, or even sheep dung to imitate proper Chinese blends. Mistresses often kept their tea locked in caddies or chests, guarding it not from thieves outside the house, but from the servants within. It was not uncommon for maids to be searched, dismissed, or even prosecuted for stealing leaves or sugar. Tea, in this sense, was a reminder. What you prepared, you might never taste. While the family drank tea in the drawing room, with creamware cups, fine sugar, and silver spoons, the servants might sip leftover dregs in chipped mugs, out of sight. They were to remain quiet, nearby, and attentive, but never involved. This was true of many rituals in 18th century households. Servants were expected to create the illusion of effortless gentility. lighting candles, removing crumbs, smoothing cushions, and adjusting the shutters to perfect the mood. But in that polished scene, they were always just offstage. Some accounts from the time, letters and household diaries, record frustrations with impertinent servants who paused too long in doorways or appeared to listen in on conversations. In this way, even proximity to leisure was policed. To stand too long in the presence of tea was to risk accusations of presumption. In many households, the management of tea, like much of the domestic sphere, was seen as women's work. The mistress of the house oversaw the ritual, but the servant performed it. This dynamic reinforced both gender and class boundaries. Books on household management, such as The Complete Servant, 1825, included entire sections on how maids should behave while serving tea. They were to be silent, swift, and graceful. Hands were to be clean but not perfumed. Hair tied back, shoes quiet. Failure to serve tea correctly could result in scolding or dismissal. One spilled drop could ruin a carpet. One chipped cup might end a position. And behind it all was the expectation of invisibility. The ideal servant was one who made luxury appear effortless, who labored without being seen. Of course, some servants did drink tea when they could afford it, but what they drank was often a weaker, cheaper version of what their employers enjoyed. Servants' tea was sometimes reused leaves, dried and brewed again. Other times, it was a knockoff blend mixed with willow, herbs, or anything that resembled tea in color. Sugar was often absent. Milk was watered down. Bread was stale. Still, tea, even bad tea, was a comfort. For many domestic workers, it marked the only real pause in the day, a quick cup in the early afternoon, if time allowed. This break, brief as it was, became a precious ritual of its own. In fact, letters from servants in the 1780s show them riding home to request a bit of good leaf, or to mention how long it had been since they last had sugar in their tea. These moments were small, but significant. In a life of constant servitude, a cup of tea was a rare act of personal agency. The management of tea was tied to surveillance. As servants prepared the beverage and brought it to their employers, they were watched. Watched for speed, posture, and obedience. Mistresses, in turn, were often anxious about theft or eavesdropping. Books like Hannah Glass, The Servant's Directory, advised mistresses to periodically test their maids' honesty by measuring tea, inspecting waste bins, and smelling kettles for improper boiling. Some went further, counting sugar cubes, locking the pantry, or placing loose tea under the mattress when traveling. For the servant, this created an atmosphere of constant suspicion. You could be perfect 9 times out of 10, but one mistake might brand you dishonest or disrespectful. Even the act of appearing tired could be cause for concern. A yawning maid might be accused of drinking tea behind the mistress's back, or worse, of feeling entitled to leisure. Despite their restrictions, many servants did find ways to resist. Letters from the time, some smuggled, others preserved by families, reveal a world of quiet rebellion. Some would hide tea leaves in their bodices or under stairboards. Others would drink cold leftovers in the early morning, long before anyone noticed. A few wrote to cousins or siblings asking for contraband tea from smugglers, bypassing the heavily taxed legal market. One maid, in Frobisher of York, wrote in 1769, "I keep my own tin now, plain black from the market, and take it in the scullery when I scrub. Mistress does not notice. She thinks I hum a hymn. It is not a hymn. It is a song from home. And story is not dramatic. She did not revolt, escape, or publish a memoir. But in her tiny, hidden tin of tea, she carved out a space for her own life, a reminder that even in servitude, one could still claim a moment of self." The grand drawing rooms of Georgian England were lit by candlelight and sustained by hot water. But behind every cup of tea was a tired hand, a burnt finger, a back bent over coals. Tea was supposed to be relaxing, a balm for the civilized soul. But what did it mean when the very thing that symbolized rest became a burden? When even the preparation of comfort was a source of fatigue? Dawn breaks over the shingle beach in Sussex. A few boats, low and silent, glide toward shore. No sails, no lights. Their cargo, crates marked as silk, but packed with something else entirely, tightly compressed bundles of black leaves. Smuggled tea, untaxed, unregulated, and desperately wanted. Atop the cliffs, a young maid watches. She's waiting for her cousin, who works the docks and trades illegally for a few ounces of leaf. It's the only tea she can afford, the only way her kitchen tin stays filled. This is not just a story about domestic service. It's a story about empire, taxation, and how something as small as tea shaped the lives of those with no power over it. In the 18th century, tea was not merely a drink. It was an imperial commodity, bound tightly to Britain's trade, taxation, and governance. The British East India Company controlled tea imports, maintaining a monopoly that kept prices high. On top of this, the government levied heavy duties. At various points in the mid-1700s, taxes could amount to over 100 of the actual value of the tea. That is, the tax was as expensive as the tea itself. Why such steep taxation? Because tea was reliable. It was consumed daily, a small indulgence that even the emerging middle class would prioritize. Taxing tea became a dependable way to fill government coffers, particularly to fund wars abroad and pay off the national debt. But for the working class, and especially for domestic servants, this made legal tea almost unreachable. The high taxes gave rise to a booming black market. Smuggling became not only common but practically institutionalized. Crews worked coastal routes, and entire villages participated in the trade, either through harboring, unloading, or discreet purchasing. By 1780, it was estimated that more than two-thirds of the tea consumed in Britain was smuggled. This shadow economy reached directly into the kitchens of the servant class. Many housemaids and cooks relied on friends, relatives, or market traders who could discreetly sell them loose-leaf tea for a fraction of the taxed price. These smuggled leaves were often lower in quality, but for many, they were better than nothing, and better than the fake tea sold by unscrupulous urban vendors, which might contain leaves dyed with copper sulfate or mixed with powdered sheep's dung. Owning your own tin of smuggled tea became a quiet badge of pride and a small act of independence. Understanding tea's value requires understanding how little domestic servants earned. In the 1770s, a general maid-of-all-work might earn between £4 and £8 per year, depending on location, employer wealth, and age. Wages were typically paid annually, sometimes quarterly. Room and board were included, but personal items, clothing, soap, candles, and of course, tea, had to be purchased by the servant herself. Let's put this into context. A pound of legal, taxed tea could cost as much as 12 shillings. A servant's annual pay might be 80 to 160 shillings. 1 pound of tea could cost up to 15 of an entire year's income. Smuggled tea brought this cost down to around 4 or 5 shillings per pound, still significant, but more manageable. Many servants saved scraps of income just for the comfort of a daily cup. Some did without, but most found a way, because tea wasn't just a beverage. It was a moment of selfhood, of pause, of familiarity in a world controlled by others. The risk of theft, or even the suspicion of it, was ever present. Domestic service blurred the lines between proximity and temptation. Servants had constant access to valuable goods, silver, wine, sugar, and especially tea. Housekeepers and mistresses often kept elaborate inventories, counting spoonfuls and checking canisters for tampering. In one London household, a footman was dismissed for allegedly taking liberties with the tea leaf. No record of proof survives, only the accusation and the replacement's name. Some households went so far as to require servants to drink designated servants' tea, usually inferior blends provided by the mistress. These were often recycled from the family's teapot or purchased from markets known for adulterated goods. Servants were forbidden from touching the household's proper tea at all. The punishment for stealing tea could be severe: dismissal, arrest, or even public whipping, depending on the value and the whim of the magistrate. For a time, tea was used to promote a certain kind of aspirational morality among the poor. Social reformers, particularly those involved in the temperance movement, encouraged the working class to drink tea instead of gin. Pamphlets from the 1780s praised tea as a civilizing influence, a way for the lower classes to emulate respectable behavior. Some employers believed that encouraging their servants to drink tea, within limits, would make them more obedient, tidy, and calm. This was tied to the idea that domestic service was a moral training ground, where young women especially could learn discipline and domestic virtues. But this illusion had a hard edge. Tea was permitted only under supervision. Its consumption had to align with the employer's standards. Anything outside that, secret tins, shared cups, or smuggled purchases, was deviance. Even when offered as a symbol of uplift, tea remained a tether. If the drawing room was the domain of order and performance, the servant's kitchen was the site of subtle rebellion. The hearth and the kettle became central to this. In quiet moments, often between shifts or late at night, servants gathered around their own small fires to share tea, bread, gossip, and laughter. These moments were not sanctioned, but they were tolerated, especially in large houses with dozens of staff. The kettle was more than a tool. It was a companion, a rhythm, a source of warmth in cold stone rooms. Its whistle signaled a pause in a life that allowed almost none. In some oral histories passed down through letters and memoirs, older servants recalled these tea breaks as their most cherished memories, not because the tea was good, but because the time was theirs. One maid wrote in 1792, "I take my tea behind the coal bucket. No sugar, no milk, but it's quiet, and the fire keeps my knees from aching." A major shift came in 1784 with the passing of the Commutation Act, spearheaded by Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. This act drastically reduced the tea tax from 119 to just 12.5, effectively undercutting the smuggling trade and making legal tea affordable to more people. This marked a major turning point. Tea smuggling rapidly declined. Legal tea consumption surged. The East India Company regained control of the market. For domestic servants, the result was a mixed blessing. Tea became more accessible, but also more regulated. Employers now expected their servants to purchase proper tea, and the previous excuse of "it's too dear" no longer held. Some employers even began deducting tea allowances from servants' wages, expecting them to supply their own, and monitoring how often they drank it. Still, for many, the reduced cost meant better quality. It was a small, quiet victory, a rare moment when the economics of empire briefly aligned with the needs of the least powerful. Throughout the late 1700s and into the 1800s, tea continued to mark the boundary between classes, not just in what was drunk, but how it was consumed. The china cup versus the tin mug, the drawing room versus the scullery, the silver spoon versus the scorched kettle lid. Even the timing mattered. Afternoon tea became fashionable among the upper classes, but servants rarely had a set time to drink. Their tea was squeezed into the gaps between chores, a sip here, a gulp there. It was a background act, never a performance. But it endured. Through taxation, suspicion, and exhaustion, the ritual of tea continued among Britain's servant class. It was private, quiet, and resilient, a thread of continuity in lives that often left no records behind. The kettle boiled in drawing rooms and in basements. The same leaves steeped in fine porcelain and in dented tin. But the difference was never the tea. It was who poured, who waited, and who was allowed to pause. When a luxury becomes a ritual, who gets to enjoy it? And who is left to serve it unseen? An old tea caddy sits on the top shelf of a locked cabinet. Its wood is dark, worn at the corners, the brass latch stiff with age. The key still hangs on a faded ribbon in the drawing room, though no one remembers why it needed locking in the first place. The servant who once dusted this cabinet, who polished the caddy's hinges and carefully never touched its contents, is long gone. Her name is not recorded in any household inventory, but her fingerprints, invisible though they are, remain. This is how many stories of domestic servants end, not with recognition, but with absence. But the echoes remain, and they often live in the rituals we take for granted. By the end of the 19th century, the British domestic service industry was already beginning its slow decline. The grand Georgian and Victorian homes were still staffed, but the Industrial Revolution had reshaped the labor landscape. New opportunities in factories, shops, and offices offered alternative employment for young women and men, options that didn't involve sleeping in cellars, rising before dawn, or being constantly watched. The census of 1851 listed over 1.2 million people in domestic service, the largest single category of employment for women. But by 1911, despite a growing population, the number had dropped. The image of the lifelong housemaid was becoming increasingly outdated. Yet even as the numbers dwindled, the memory of servitude persisted. in etiquette books, in inherited furniture, and most of all, in the rituals of tea. The rise of afternoon tea in the mid-19th century transformed tea drinking from a practical comfort into an elegant performance. Popularized by Anna, the seventh Duchess of Bedford, the ritual offered an upper-class solution to the long gap between lunch and dinner. Servants were expected to lay out delicate finger foods, cakes, and multiple tea blends on silver trays. The presentation was everything: lace cloths, bone china, tiered stands, and fresh flowers. But behind this refined tradition was the same old machinery. The water boiled in basement kitchens. The linen was scrubbed by hand. The pastries were made, not bought. While guests admired the hostess's light touch, dozens of hands labored out of sight. It was performance sustained by precision, and by people who had no role in the narrative beyond service. Afternoon tea, in this sense, became a fantasy of leisure that relied on others never being allowed to rest. Tea was a central character in the story of British domestic life, but never the protagonist. It passed through hands, rituals, and rooms, acting as a bridge between classes. Yet the hands that served it often disappeared from history. Few servant memoirs survive from the 18th century. Most could not write. Those who could rarely had the time. Their names appear briefly in payroll ledgers, court records, or employer letters, usually only when something went wrong. But their impact lingered in how tea was prepared, when it was served, and what it came to represent. Even as servant numbers declined, the expectations they upheld remained. That tea should appear effortlessly. That comfort should come without interruption. That someone, somewhere, was making it happen. These expectations didn't vanish. They evolved into the rituals of the tea trolley, the hotel tea service, the office kitchen, and eventually, the electric kettle on a modern counter. As the 20th century progressed, the meanings of tea changed again. No longer a heavily taxed luxury, tea became affordable, accessible, and symbolic of respectability. Working-class households embraced tea as a cornerstone of hospitality. Guests were welcomed with a hot pot, even if the cupboards were nearly bare. In a strange reversal, many of the rituals once restricted to the elite, pouring with the right hand, heating the pot, adding milk last, were adopted in modest homes across Britain as signs of good manners. The irony was not lost. Where once servants were dismissed for drinking tea, now shopkeepers and typists alike imitated the very customs once used to exclude them. Yet the original labor, the early mornings, the scorched kettles, the locked caddies, had faded from view. In the 20th century, particularly after World War I, tea became linked to labor rights in a surprising way. Factory workers began demanding regular tea breaks, short periods of rest to drink, warm up, and breathe. These breaks were hard-won and often resisted by employers who feared lost productivity. But the argument held: a rested worker was a better worker. And tea, humble, hot, and quick to brew, became the symbol of that rest. By the 1950s, the tea break was institutionalized in British working life. It marked a profound shift from the world of Eliza and Anne, the 18th century maids who boiled water without pause. Now, for the first time, boiling water was a right, not just a duty. Fast forward to a modern kitchen. An electric kettle clicks to life. A tea bag dangles in a cup. Milk is poured, sugar added. The moment lasts 2 minutes, maybe less. A gesture barely thought about. But behind that gesture lies 2 centuries of labor history, of control, of quiet rebellion, of invisible hands working before dawn. Tea still holds echoes of class and gender expectations. In many households, even today, the preparation of tea falls disproportionately to women. Guests still wait to be served. Hosts still perform. And the idea that comfort should be effortless, that hospitality should just happen, remains deeply ingrained. The 18th century servant no longer lights the fire, but her ghost lingers in the corner of every well-appointed drawing room, in every spotless kitchen, in every silent expectation that the kettle will already be on. Let's return to Eliza, the girl from Section 1, scrubbing the kitchen floors of a London townhouse in 1765. We don't know what became of her. Most Elizas vanished from the record after marriage, dismissal, or death. But perhaps she left the city. Perhaps she became a cook in a smaller home, or moved north to work in a factory. Maybe, just maybe, She kept a tin of tea hidden in her apron pocket. Her life was not recorded, but her movement was. Every time she carried a tray upstairs without spilling. Every time she cleaned a teacup without complaint. Every time she paused by the fire for just a second longer than allowed. Her legacy lives not in monuments, but in motions, in the rituals we've forgotten we inherited. The next time you pour a cup of tea, pay attention to your hands. The way you lift the kettle, the pause before you pour, the feel of steam against your face. These are small gestures, but they're old ones. Generations have done the same, in castles, kitchens, sculleries, and break rooms. What feels mundane was once sacred. What feels relaxing was once restricted. And what we now call leisure was once someone else's work. Tea began as a luxury. It became a tax, then a ritual, then a rite. But in every stage, it passed through hands that rarely got to rest. The history of tea in Britain is not just a story of empire or etiquette. It is the story of invisible labor, of the people who boiled the water, carried the trays, and polished the caddies, without ever being invited to sit. They are not remembered in books, but they are remembered in every sip. The kettle boils, the cup is poured, and somewhere, just out of frame, someone has made it all appear. A cold wind drags across the field, tugging at the faded red of a British soldier's coat. He stands upright, but the seams of his uniform are frayed, the brass buttons tarnished, 2 of them missing. His sergeant frowns and makes a note on a small board. Uniform breach. This soldier has fought 3 battles. He has walked 80 miles in wet leather boots. But today, it is not his wounds or his courage under fire that draw scrutiny. It is his missing buttons. In the British Army of the late 18th century, uniform regulations were no trivial matter. They were central to identity, discipline, and soon, controversy. For the button was not just a fastener. It was a symbol, a logistical problem, a political battleground. By the end of the 1700s, European armies had become distinctly color-coded. French soldiers wore blue, Austrians white, and the British famously red, a color chosen not for camouflage, but for cohesion and intimidation. Uniforms were intended to erase individuality. A recruit, once dressed, was no longer a farmer or clerk. He was a soldier, a cog in the machinery of empire. But the uniform also had to be maintained, patched, pressed, and complete. In a world where appearance equated to discipline, the state of a soldier's coat could determine his fate. Missing buttons meant sloppiness. Sloppiness meant disobedience. And disobedience, in the rigid hierarchy of 18th century military life, could be punished by flogging. Buttons weren't just decorative. They were standardized, counted, and inspected. Each regiment had its own design, often embossed with numbers, crowns, or symbols of the monarch, and regulations dictated how many buttons each soldier's coat should display. Infantry, 10 to 12 brass buttons down the front. Cavalry, silver or pewter buttons, often larger and sometimes rimmed with regimental trim. Officers, finer materials, more elaborate designs, and additional decorative buttons on cuffs or lapels. Regimental tailors were required to log the distribution and maintenance of buttons in ledgers. Quartermasters received annual shipments from government-approved suppliers, but delays, corruption, and shortages were rampant. In some campaigns, buttons became scarce. Soldiers sewed coins, wooden discs, or bone tokens onto their coats just to pass inspection. And when that failed, they were fined. Or worse, punished for neglecting military appearance. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British Army was stretched thin across multiple fronts, from Portugal to Egypt to India. Supplying soldiers with fresh uniforms became a logistical nightmare. Ships carrying military clothing were slow, vulnerable to weather, and often targeted by enemy forces. Buttons, being small and often packed separately from uniforms, were particularly prone to being lost or delayed. In 1807, a shipment bound for troops in the Iberian Peninsula was lost off the coast of Portugal. The result? Hundreds of soldiers appeared in mismatched coats, with makeshift fasteners, and were ridiculed not only by their enemies, but by their own officers. General Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, noted in correspondence, "It is intolerable that my men should appear as beggars in red rags, while the French march as if painted." The shortage grew severe enough that some regiments were ordered to remove the bottom 2 buttons from their coats and redistribute them upward to create the illusion of completeness. In many armies of the 18th and early 19th centuries, military discipline was enforced not just through orders, but through the minutiae of appearance. A uniform out of regulation was considered a breach of command. In Britain, soldiers could be docked pay or subjected to the lash for appearing improperly dressed, even if the problem was due to supply shortages rather than negligence. A court-martial record from 1798 shows Private Thomas Bell of the 42nd Regiment charged with dereliction of military image, his offense being the omission of required brass fastening on the breast of his coat. The punishment? 3 days in the stocks, public shaming, and the cost of the replacement button deducted from his already meager pay. No one asked where the missing button had gone. The British military relied on civilian contractors to supply its uniforms. These contracts were lucrative and prone to abuse. Buttons were often produced in workshops in Birmingham or Sheffield, stamped from brass or pewter, and sent in bulk to quartermasters. But unscrupulous suppliers frequently used thinner metals or reduced weights, making buttons that tarnished quickly or broke. Tailors were often underpaid and overworked. In some cases, they cut corners, using inferior thread or attaching buttons with only 1 or 2 stitches. The buttons would fall off in the field, but the blame always fell on the soldier. A scandal broke in 1804 when it was discovered that a contractor for the Royal Marines had been supplying uniforms with imitation buttons, brass-coated wood. Dozens of Marines arrived for duty with buttons that crumbled in rain. An investigation was launched. The contractor was fined, but the soldiers still had their pay docked for appearing improperly dressed. Maintaining a uniform was the soldier's personal responsibility. He had to mend, clean, and press his own clothing, despite minimal supplies or training. For most enlisted men, there were no extra buttons. If one fell off, they had to buy a replacement, often from regimental sutlers who charged inflated prices. A single brass button might cost as much as a day's beer ration. Soldiers developed habits, sewing spare buttons inside coat linings, using thread pulled from their own socks, trading buttons with the wounded or dead. These small survival strategies became part of military culture. A well-dressed soldier was seen as a man of pride. A missing button could start a fight. In the journals of an infantry corporal from 1796, he writes, "My coat is thin. My feet bleed. But I have all my buttons," and the sergeant nods when he sees me. Why did buttons matter so much? Because they were visible, inspectable, quantifiable. In a military system obsessed with order and hierarchy, appearance became a proxy for loyalty. A soldier could be ill, homesick, or grieving, but so long as he was buttoned up, he was considered ready. And a missing button? That suggested disorder, the beginning of decline. If a man could not keep his coat intact, what else might unravel? This thinking extended beyond clothing. It shaped military law, training manuals, even burial rites. A dead soldier, even in a field grave, was often laid to rest with his buttons polished, a last display of discipline. The uniform, and especially the buttons, was not just about clothing. It was about control. The obsession with buttons reached a strange climax in a battle few remember. In the winter of 1809, during the retreat to Corunna in Spain, a group of British soldiers, cold, starving, and low on supplies, began stripping uniforms from the dead. It wasn't looting. It was necessity. But officers, seeing men in coats from other regiments, panicked. Reports of desertion rose. Discipline fractured. Entire units were punished for appearing in disguise. A captain wrote, "I fear we lose more to the appearance of confusion than to the French. Men cannot march when we do not know who they are." In that moment, the button, meant to unify, became a source of confusion and fear. And the soldier, already burdened with pack, musket, and fatigue, carried one more weight: the expectation to appear whole, even when broken. It is easy to overlook a button, small, round, silent. But in the armies of empire, it was a symbol of precision, of power, of punishment. What does it mean when something so small can determine a soldier's worth? And what happens when the state cares more for the brass on your coat than the body underneath? Dust drifts in sunbeams. Crates line the walls, some stamped with the royal crown, others with stenciled regimental numbers. A quartermaster kneels with a ledger, inspecting rows of small brown packages. He opens one. Buttons. Thousands of them. Brass. gleaming, newly minted. But they're late. 3 months late. The ships were delayed by storms, and half the crates never arrived. Yet the war in Europe rages, and uniforms are needed. He signs the form anyway. This is the fragile heart of the British Army's logistics. A button supply chain stretched across oceans, reliant on calm seas, honest contractors, and imperial ambition. And when that system cracks, it's not just uniforms that fall apart. Before mass production, buttons were handmade, cast or stamped in small batches by craftsmen. Materials ranged from bone, horn, wood, and mother of pearl to pewter and brass. In Britain, towns like Birmingham and Sheffield became hubs for button making by the mid-18th century, their output feeding both civilian fashion and military need. The military's demand was predictable but enormous. Each regiment had distinct button designs, numbers, crests, crown types, and contracts were given to suppliers who could meet the demand with precision and scale. But quality varied, and corruption crept in. Some manufacturers subcontracted to unlicensed workshops. Others used cheaper materials and pocketed the difference. The result? Buttons that snapped in cold, corroded in damp, or simply never fit the holes sewn for them. And unlike bullets or bread, broken buttons didn't immediately threaten survival, which meant their defects were noticed late, and often at the expense of the rank and file. Military bureaucracy flourished in the details. Every item, from muskets to boots to buttons, had a designated shelf life and paper trail. Ledgers recorded button shipments, distributions, replacements, and losses. Each soldier received one coat per year, sometimes stretched to two. A regulation number of buttons, usually 10 to 12 for front closure, plus 4 to 6 for cuffs, lapels, and tails. A small repair allowance, meant for thread and fasteners. Tailors attached buttons to new uniforms, but once issued, the burden fell to the soldier. If a button went missing, he was expected to report it to his sergeant, request a replacement from the regimental store, so it back himself promptly. Failure to do so could result in disciplinary measures, especially if the deficiency was spotted on parade or before a superior. This process worked well in theory, but in practice, wartime chaos made even the smallest repairs a challenge. Regimental tailors were often forgotten cogs in the military machine. They were craftsmen, sometimes civilians, attached to a unit. Their task: repair uniforms, adjust sizes, and, most of all, replace buttons. These tailors operated out of tents, sheds, or borrowed rooms. Supplies were limited. Button stock was controlled by quartermasters, who themselves depended on deliveries that might never arrive. Tailors grew adept at improvisation. Some cut buttons from animal bone or repurposed civilian fasteners. Others salvaged from the coats of the dead. A tailor for the 52nd Foot Regiment in 1810 wrote in a letter, "I sew more buttons than stitches. They fall like snow, rusted or snapped, and still the sergeant shouts. I've taken to keeping a string of spares round my neck like a rosary." Tailors were underpaid and undervalued, but the functioning of an army depended on their invisible labor. Wherever scarcity exists, so does opportunism. And in wartime Britain, a clandestine trade in military materials flourished, including buttons. Soldiers sometimes stole from storehouses. Quartermasters, corrupted by profit, sold excess supply on the civilian market. Sutlers, mobile vendors who followed armies, charged steep prices for replacements, especially for buttons with specific regimental markings. In some cities, street markets openly sold replica military buttons. These were used by imposters hoping to collect veteran pensions, pickpockets in disguise, deserting soldiers trying to rejoin under new identities. The military responded with harsh penalties. In 1809, a soldier caught with 5 unauthorized fasteners was court-martialed for impersonation. He was flogged publicly and discharged without pay. The button had become more than part of a uniform. It was a marker of identity, legal, military, and symbolic. The obsession with regulation had unforeseen consequences in the field. In the Peninsular Campaign, 1807 to 1814, British troops fought in difficult terrain under brutal weather. Rains turned roads to mud, and uniforms, already poorly sewn, deteriorated rapidly. But inspections remained rigid. A soldier who lost a button due to wet rot might still be charged with negligence. Officers, many of them from aristocratic backgrounds, valued appearance as a stand-in for discipline. Troops were reprimanded not for cowardice or confusion, but for dirty boots or unpolished buttons. Meanwhile, French soldiers, known for their often looser regulations and greater use of local materials, adapted more easily. Some British regiments, inspired by this, began allowing minor uniform modifications, including buttons tied with string or sealed with wax in emergencies. But these changes were unofficial. Innovation, in the world of British uniforms, was often punished. Back in London, Parliament occasionally debated military dress, not from concern for soldiers, but from pressure by contractors, fashion guilds, or nationalist sentiment. Changes to button design or uniform color often stemmed from shifts in monarchy requiring new symbols, changes in military structure, e.g., renumbering regiments, lobbying by suppliers wanting new contracts. Every design change required new molds, new shipments, new distributions, all of which cost money and caused chaos. In 1803, a change to the crown symbol on officer buttons led to a backlog of 40,000 coats awaiting proper finishings. Troops were delayed, officers complained, and tailors scrambled, all because of a symbol the enemy wouldn't even notice. Buttons were tiny, but their bureaucratic footprint was enormous. Private Edwin Small of the 95th Rifles served from 1809 to 1815. His personal journal, discovered in the 1860s, includes this passage: "My right breast button fell in the Douro. Lost in the mud. I tied the coat with horsehair and prayed none would see. Lieutenant brushed past me on inspection. His nose curled, but he said nothing. That mercy was worth more than my boots." Small's story was not unique, but it captures the quiet desperation of soldiers who faced not only death and disease, but the ever-watchful eye of bureaucracy. Sometimes, survival meant not being seen. Sometimes, it meant sewing fast and lying well. As the Napoleonic Wars drew to a close, Britain began re-evaluating its military systems. The wars had been long and costly, and the cracks in logistical chains, including the button debacle, were widely acknowledged. By the 1830s, uniform design was gradually simplified. Buttons became more standardized across regiments. Mass production began to replace artisan workshops. Sewing machines, introduced in the mid-19th century, sped up production. Tailors could now attach buttons faster, more securely. Factory-made uniforms meant consistency and fewer opportunities for corruption. But these changes also meant more surveillance. If every coat was identical, any flaw was more obvious. The button's burden did not vanish. It merely became easier to count. The soldier stood straight, boots polished, musket in hand. But his coat, patched, faded, held together by a mismatched row of buttons, betrayed the truth. In the end, what unraveled armies was not always the gun or the saber, but the stitch, the seam, the button that could not hold. When a war depends on appearances, what happens when the fabric begins to fray? In a glass case sits a faded red military coat. Its fabric is moth-eaten, its lining torn, but the buttons gleam, polished brass, each bearing the crest of the 33rd Regiment. They are out of sequence, two from a different regiment, one clearly dented. A placard reads, "Private's coat, circa 1809. Waterloo Campaign. Buttons restored." Restored, but not original, not as it was worn. This coat tells a story, but not all of it. Its owner's name is unknown, his battles unrecorded. All that remains is the uniform and the buttons, shining now, but silent. This is where the button war ends, not on the battlefield, but in how we remember what soldiers wore and what they endured to maintain it. The 18th and 19th century military placed enormous emphasis on the visual presentation of the soldier. Parade grounds were stages. Marching was choreography. The uniform was not just clothing. It was a message to allies, enemies, and the public that the army was disciplined, modern, and powerful. Buttons, polished to shine like mirrors, became part of that performance. Soldiers were often required to carry small cloths and metal polish in their packs to maintain their appearance. Button cleaning was a daily task, as much a part of the routine as weapons drills or foot inspections. Some officers judged men not by their aim or courage, but by the clarity of their buttons. A perfectly polished row could mean promotion. A dull or tarnished one might delay leave or rations. This obsession with outward order masked the inward disorder: hunger, disease, homesickness, exhaustion. But appearances held the line. After major campaigns, especially Waterloo, victorious troops returned not to peace, but to spectacle. Victory parades in London featured full regalia. Officers and enlisted men were issued fresh coats, brand new boots, and complete sets of buttons. Regiments were rebuttoned, literally and figuratively, to display Britain's military prestige. Crowds cheered. Children waved flags. Painters captured scenes with exaggerated neatness. But many of the men in those parades had worn rags just months before. They had sewn their coats shut with fishing line. They had fought with tunics half open, held together by belts or rope. Their actual battlefield attire was never paraded, it was replaced. This act of reuniforming served a political purpose: to rewrite the story, to smooth over the chaos of war with the order of brass. For many veterans, buttons became treasured keepsakes. Soldiers often kept one, just one, after discharge. It might be sewn into a pouch, turned into a brooch, or kept in a drawer. Some used them as cufflinks or walking stick toppers. Others pressed them into wood as mementos. There are letters from widows who mailed buttons to regimental offices, hoping to trace a lost husband's service. Museums received button donations wrapped in old socks, with notes: "My father's, from Salamanca." Buttons outlived the men who wore them. They rusted slower than memory. But their survival often came detached from context. The story behind each button, whose hands polished it, whose needle stitched it, faded. In time, they became artifacts, stripped of the labor that maintained them. Behind every row of gleaming buttons was a tailor, civilian or military, man or woman, whose work made uniformity possible. Most military tailors worked in workshops, far from the battlefield. They were often anonymous, overworked, and chronically underpaid. Some were widows or disabled veterans themselves, stitching for pennies. During wartime surges, the Army relied on what were called piece-rate stitchers, workers paid by the coat or the buttonhole. Their names don't appear in military records, but their labor is woven into every surviving uniform in every museum. Even child labor played a role. In 1799, the Button Makers Guild petitioned Parliament to allow boys as young as 7 to assist in pressing metal blanks, citing the national urgency of war. Each button polished on parade likely passed through a dozen hands. But those hands are not commemorated. We remember the regiment, not the needle. The British military began re-evaluating its dress regulations after the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, where poor clothing led to frostbite, disease, and morale collapse. Uniform deficiencies were no longer merely aesthetic, they were lethal. Reports from the front described soldiers in threadbare coats, their buttons ripped off by cold hands or simply eroded by wet. In response, the Army moved towards simplified, more practical designs. The iconic red was replaced with khaki for field use. Button counts were reduced. Function began to take precedence over form. But the old attitudes lingered. Dress inspections still emphasized brass clarity. Drill manuals still instructed sergeants to check each man's buttons individually. The war machine had acknowledged the failure, but could not fully let go of the appearance of control. By the late 19th century, the military uniform had split in two: field dress, practical, subdued, functional; parade dress, ceremonial, ornate, button-heavy. The latter became a kind of costume, worn not in battle, but in display. Military bands, honor guards, and royal ceremonies brought the button back into public view. Some regiments retained elaborate dress codes purely for tradition. Buttons were polished with toothbrushes. Lint was removed with wax. Cap badges were buffed until they reflected faces. These traditions continue today, in part as tribute, in part as performance. But many soldiers have noted the disconnect. One British corporal, interviewed in 1995, said, "We polish for funerals and queens, not for the fight. The brass is for the civilians." Even now, the button retains its symbolic power, but its purpose has changed. Modern military museums are filled with buttons. They are arranged in cases, lined up by regiment, cataloged by year. Some are framed, others lie in drawers. Few come with stories. And yet, those buttons once marked a man as part of something larger, determined whether he was punished or promoted. decided if he was respected or ignored. The museum cases rarely mention the shortages, or the court-martials, or the cold fingers that failed to sew fast enough. This is the great irony of historical memory, that the preserved often lacks the pain, and the discarded held the truth. The buttons remain. The hands that stitched them, punished over them, or bled beneath them, do not. Today, the button is so commonplace that it goes unnoticed. Plastic fasteners on modern coats bear no crest, no weight, no ritual. They are made by machines, sewn by machines, and often discarded with the garment itself. But in military dress, the button lingers as a ceremonial relic, one foot in history, one in symbolism. For historians, reenactors, and descendants, the military button has become a kind of totem, proof of service, of legacy, of identity. It speaks softly now, but it once shouted discipline, compliance, sacrifice, and for many soldiers, a missing button said more about their lives than any medal ever could. A button is small, circular, replaceable, but in 18th and 19th century Britain, it held together more than fabric. It bound soldiers to a system. It marked bodies for praise or punishment. It symbolized order, even when order was impossible. We often remember wars through battles and generals, but sometimes history is stitched in the seams, held fast by the smallest things. What if the best way to understand an empire is to follow a single lost button? The air is heavy with the scent of salted pork and boiled cabbage. A tin basin rests on the windowsill, filled with cloudy water and lumps of yellowing butter. Beside it, a wooden box lined with sawdust slowly leaks across the floor. Inside that box is a block of melting ice, delivered 3 days ago from a man with tongs and a horse cart. It cost nearly half a day's wages, and it is almost gone. This is refrigeration in the mid-19th century, fragile, fleeting, and deeply inconvenient. Before the hum of electric fridges, the world turned to other methods. Some ancient, some desperate, some quietly ingenious. This is the story of how humanity tried to stop things from going bad. For most of human history, food storage was a losing battle. Meat spoiled, milk soured, butter turned rancid. Fish, without salt or smoke, became inedible within hours. Even bread, in warm climates, went moldy in days. Spoilage wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a major threat to survival. Throughout the 1700s and early 1800s, people developed intricate routines around perishability. Shopping was done daily. Slaughtering animals required coordination. Cooking was planned to minimize leftovers. Food safety wasn't scientific. It was practical. You smelled the milk. You poked the meat. You listened for the hiss of fermentation. And when something spoiled, you didn't throw it away. You tried to salvage it. Boil it. Salt it. Cover it in spice and hope. Before mechanical refrigeration, people employed a patchwork of strategies to keep things cool, most of them highly dependent on geography and season. Larders were built on the north side of houses to avoid direct sunlight. Cellars and basements were used for root vegetables, milk, and preserved meats. Spring houses, small stone huts over running water, served as early refrigerators. Clay pots were buried underground. Foods were wrapped in wet cloth and placed in breezy windows to encourage evaporation cooling. In India and North Africa, traditional zaire pots, clay and clay pot coolers, were used to store perishables. Still, these methods were imprecise and labor-intensive. Cooling was never guaranteed. You could spend hours digging, soaking, checking, only to find your butter still swimming in whey. Ice was once a seasonal miracle. In winter, frozen lakes and rivers were carved into blocks and stored in ice houses, deep pits or insulated structures that could keep ice solid through summer months. The elite, aristocrats, wealthy merchants, used these ice stores to chill drinks, make desserts, or preserve food longer. But access was exclusive. Ice was expensive to harvest, and ice houses were costly to build and maintain. In the 18th century, serving chilled wine in July was a symbol of immense wealth. A molded dessert made of snow, honey, and fruit was a culinary boast. For the average person, ice was simply unavailable for most of the year. That would begin to change, not through invention, but through trade. In 1806, a Boston businessman named Frederick Tudor had a ridiculous idea: ship ice from New England to the Caribbean. Everyone laughed. The voyage was long. The product melted. But he persisted. By the 1830s, Tudor had established a booming ice export business, shipping massive blocks of frozen lake water, carefully insulated with sawdust, to ports in India, Brazil, Cuba, and New Orleans. This became known as the Great Ice Trade. Ice harvested from frozen lakes in Massachusetts was packed into the holds of ships and sent around the world. It was sold to hospitals, restaurants, hotels, and eventually, households. Ice delivery became a business. Horse-drawn wagons clattered through city streets. Men in leather aprons hauling heavy blocks with iron tongs, carving them down to customer size with saws and picks. In cities like New York, ice became a middle-class aspiration, a symbol of modern living. But it was still volatile. A hot summer meant shortages. A warm winter meant disaster for suppliers. And storing it properly was a constant challenge. To take advantage of delivered ice, households began using ice boxes, insulated wooden cabinets lined with zinc or tin, often filled with straw, cork, or sawdust. A block of ice was placed in the upper compartment, and as it melted, cold air flowed downward. Meltwater was collected in a drip tray or pan below, which had to be emptied manually, lest it overflow and attract pests. Iceboxes were beautiful pieces of furniture, often made of oak or mahogany, but required constant attention. The ice melted in a matter of days. Milk turned if the pan wasn't emptied. Food spoiled if the iceman came late. Many households scheduled their day around the ice delivery. Children watched for the cart. Housemaids traded gossip with the deliverman. Some people left signs in their windows, 25 pounds today, or chalked requests on the stoop. And if you couldn't afford ice, you used a bucket in the shade, or salted everything, or simply hoped it didn't go off before dinner. No food item reveals the struggle against heat better than butter. Butter, in an age before refrigeration, was dangerously fragile. In the summer months, it melted into oil, turned rancid, or became unspreadable clumps. The smell alone could sour an entire kitchen. To cope, people used butter bells, ceramic crocks that used water to form an airtight seal, cold pans, filled with water or brine and set by windows, underground crocks, buried under kitchen tiles or shaded trees. Milk was even worse. In urban centers, it spoiled within hours and often arrived already sour, having been ladled from open cans and exposed to flies. Cheese was a safer alternative, as was clabbered milk, a semi-fermented, lumpy product that could be turned into curds or mixed into bread dough. Children grew up familiar with the taste of sourness. It wasn't pleasant, but it was normal. Freshness, as we now know it, was almost unheard of. Because long-term cooling wasn't reliable, people learned to preserve food by changing it. Salting. Meat and fish were packed in salt to draw out moisture and inhibit bacteria. Smoking. Foods were exposed to smoke, which both dried and infused antimicrobial compounds. Pickling. Vinegar, brine, and sugar created hostile environments for spoilage. Drying. Fruits, herbs, and even meat were sun-dried or oven-dried. Preservation wasn't just about extending shelf life. It defined taste. Spices, once used to cover the flavor of borderline meat, became cultural mainstays. Sweet pickles and fermented cabbage weren't delicacies. They were survival tools. Every region had its own methods. Every household had its own recipes. And every cook had to know how to pivot. When a chicken turned, when butter wept, when milk clumped. Cooking wasn't just creative. It was defensive. In the late 19th century, public health reformers began to campaign for better food storage, linking spoilage to disease. Spoiled milk was blamed for infant mortality. Tainted meat led to cholera outbreaks. Urban slums, with no access to ice or cool storage, suffered disproportionately. Reformers pushed for better regulation of food vendors, subsidized ice access in poor neighborhoods, inspection of dairies and ice companies. By the 1880s, refrigeration was no longer seen as a luxury. It was framed as a public good. Hospitals used ice to preserve medicine and cool fevers. Butchers installed ice boxes. Railcars were retrofitted with ice compartments to ship meat long distances. The world was changing. But even as mechanical refrigeration began to emerge, in factories, breweries, and meatpacking plants, the home icebox remained dominant. The hum of electric fridges was still decades away. The kitchen of 1848 was hot, loud, and perpetually moist. It smelled of brine and yeast, of vinegar and rot. And yet, the ice still arrived. The box still dripped. The butter was salvaged, the milk poured fast, the dinner served. What does it say about a world where food was always on the edge of decay? And how did we learn to live, patiently, skillfully, inside that constant melt? The air is bitter. Horses stamp nervously on the frozen lake as teams of men scrape long, straight lines across the surface. Their tools are precise: metal-toothed saws, ice plows, tongs, hooks. Beneath their boots, the ice groans. They are harvesting winter. Within days, blocks of crystal-clear ice, each weighing over 100 pounds, will be packed in sawdust, loaded onto ships, and sent not just to Boston or Philadelphia, but to Calcutta, Havana, and Rio de Janeiro. Ice is no longer local. It's an industry, a global one. By the mid-19th century, entire towns in the northeastern United States were built around the ice trade. In winter, lakes and ponds were mapped, measured, and divided into grids. Once the ice reached 12 to 18 inches thick, crews moved in with saws, chisels, and horse-drawn scrapers. Blocks were cut, floated into channels, and winched into enormous ice houses, tall, windowless structures insulated with sawdust or straw. Each ice house might hold thousands of tons of ice. From there, blocks were shipped in insulated rail cars or sealed holds of clipper ships, packed tightly to reduce melting. The entire process was timed with military precision. And the workers? Often poorly paid, frostbitten, and injured by slipping, falling through ice, or handling heavy blocks. Still, it was steady work. For 6 to 8 weeks each year, communities relied on the harvest, a kind of cold gold rush. Frederick Tudor, the Boston Ice King, proved that cold could travel. But others expanded the vision. By the 1850s, British India imported thousands of tons of New England ice annually. Ice houses were built in Bombay and Calcutta, lined with lime and horsehair insulation. Cuba, Brazil, and Jamaica developed local markets for American ice, used in medicine, drinks, and elite gatherings. Wealthy families in New Orleans, Charleston, and Savannah ordered weekly ice deliveries by steamer. This trade reshaped expectations. Where once summer meant warm beer and sour milk, now it meant iced punch, chilled cream, and preserved meat, if you could afford it. Ice had become aspirational. As urban populations swelled, cities began building their own ice infrastructure. Ice depots appeared near docks and rail yards. Ice delivery companies created complex routes, marked by tin signs left on doors. Apartment buildings installed shared ice boxes in lobbies or stairwells. Hotels, restaurants, and fish markets built walk-in ice rooms, cooled not by machinery, but by stacking massive ice blocks in central pits. The city's cold was now architectural. It lived in wood, tin, and insulation, and it was labor-intensive. In New York alone, by 1870, over 3,000 ice delivery men, often immigrants, hauled blocks up flights of stairs, into pantries, onto street carts. They were known as icemen, and their presence was as routine as the milkman or chimney sweep. Each morning, the iceman began his rounds. He moved quickly, carrying iron tongs over one shoulder and a block of ice on his back, often wrapped in burlap to prevent melting and injury. Customers left signs, 25 pounds, chalked on the stoop. Icy cards in the window, flipped to indicate desired weight. The iceman didn't linger. He slid the ice into the box, swapped pans, took payment, sometimes left on the counter, sometimes on credit. In working-class neighborhoods, children chased the cart, hoping for chips of ice to suck on during the summer heat. For many households, especially in cities, the iceman was the last connection to the world beyond, a daily visitor, dependable and mute, bringing order to a perishable life. Despite its reach, the ice trade was fragile. A warm winter in New England could devastate the harvest. Spoilage at sea, poor insulation, or delays could wipe out profits. In southern climates, 40 to 60 of ice cargo often melted before arrival. Colonial governments, especially in India, began investing in local ice production, building insulated factories to reduce dependence on imports. As technology advanced, inventors began experimenting with mechanical refrigeration, crude machines using ammonia, ether, or compressed air to produce cold. These early machines were dangerous, noisy, and often broke down, but they worked. By the 1870s, breweries in Germany and slaughterhouses in Chicago began adopting them. Ice making had become industrialized. The global ice trade had met its rival. While ice became more common in urban centers, it remained inaccessible to many, especially the rural poor, people of color, and tenant laborers. Ice was still a subscription service, like milk or coal. If you couldn't afford it, you didn't get it. Cheap ice boxes were prone to leaks, mold, and spoilage. Without ventilation or insulation, food still turned, and fast. In poor districts, alternative methods persisted. Meat wrapped in wet cloth and stored in wells. Butter kept in jars, submerged in cool water. Cold air funnels. Tubes run from cellar to kitchen to maintain airflow. These methods worked. Barely. Spoilage remained common. And where food spoiled, disease followed. Infant mortality, dysentery, and foodborne illness were higher in areas without access to cold storage. Refrigeration was not yet a right. It was a privilege, unevenly distributed. By the turn of the century, the icebox had become more than a tool. It was a piece of middle-class identity. Catalogs offered models in walnut, ash, or oak. Some had brass fittings, glass panels, and decorative vents. Manufacturers marketed them like pianos or bookcases. Ads praised them as clean, sanitary, and gentlemanly. In some homes, the icebox stood in the parlor, a showpiece as well as a storage unit. Guests would hear the clink of melting ice, the soft hiss of cold butter unwrapped. A well-stocked icebox became a marker of good housekeeping, moderation, and prosperity. It wasn't just about keeping food fresh. It was about appearing modern, prepared, respectable. And for housewives, it was a new chore, tracking the melt, coordinating deliveries, and cleaning the dreaded drip pan. By the early 20th century, mechanical refrigeration had made its way into dairies, meatpacking plants, hospitals, laboratories, but the home was still icebound. Electric refrigerators existed, but they were rare, expensive, and required reliable power. That ruled out rural areas and working-class homes. The tipping point came gradually. Cities modernized electric grids. Companies like General Electric and Frigidaire began mass-producing smaller, safer home units. Advertisers reframed refrigeration as hygienic, essential for clean motherhood and modern families. Public health officials joined in, citing its role in reducing spoilage and infection. By the 1930s, electric fridges began replacing iceboxes, first in wealthy homes, then, over decades, across the nation. The iceman's route shrank. The lake harvest dwindled. Ice houses were abandoned. Cold had become automated. The ice that once crossed oceans now came from humming boxes in kitchen corners. But behind that hum was a story of labor, risk, and effort. Horses on frozen lakes, backs bent under dripping blocks, sawdust-stuffed ships racing against time. We gained convenience, but we lost the world built to serve the melt. What is remembered of a world where cold had to be carved, packed, delivered, and still disappeared before nightfall? A smiling housewife, wearing pearls and heels, places a fresh roast into a gleaming white appliance. Her dress is spotless. The room is bright. The fridge door is open just enough to reveal a tidy interior, milk bottles, butter, a neat row of eggs. The tagline reads, "Cold at your fingertips, no more waiting for the iceman. No melting, no sawdust, no horses, no heavy lifting. The transformation is complete. Cold is no longer seasonal, labor-intensive, or expensive. It's built into the wall, taken for granted, and humming in the background. But behind that hum lies a long, invisible history of servants scrubbing drip pans, of lake workers losing fingers to frostbite, of meals planned around what would spoil first. And now we forget, because the cold has become boring. Electric refrigerators first appeared in the early 1910s, but they were rare. Early models were large, loud, and prone to leaking refrigerant gases like ammonia or sulfur dioxide. But by the 1920s and 1930s, improvements made them safer and quieter. The introduction of Freon, chlorofluorocarbon gas, as a coolant in 1928 revolutionized the appliance. Freon didn't smell, didn't poison, and didn't explode, at least not immediately. Mass production followed. Brands like Frigidaire, a division of General Motors, Kelvinator, GE Monitor Top, battled for dominance in the middle-class kitchen. By 1937, Roughly 1 in every 5 urban American homes had an electric refrigerator. In the UK and elsewhere, adoption was slower, but the trend had begun. The refrigerator was becoming standard. The icebox was being sold as antique. The ice delivery industry didn't vanish overnight. In many towns, especially in working-class and rural communities, the iceman continued into the 1940s and 50s. Some regions, without reliable electricity, relied on ice well into the 1960s. But the writing was on the wall. Demand declined as fridges got cheaper. Rail companies shifted focus away from ice shipments. Ice houses closed, or were converted into storage units and factories. Some icemen adapted, selling bagged ice or dry ice. Others changed trades entirely. A 1952 article in the Saturday Evening Post profiled one such man in Chicago, 30 years on the same block, hauling 20 pounds at a time, in rain and heat. Now they say no one needs me. But I hear the hum in every kitchen, and I know. It's already over. For the families that once depended on him, the silence was striking. No more tongs. No more door signs. Just a fridge that never knocked. Refrigeration changed the rhythm of domestic life. No longer was food purchased daily. Milk didn't have to be boiled within hours. Leftovers became viable. Weekly grocery shopping was possible. Entire categories of food, previously unthinkable, became staples. Soft cheeses, leafy greens, ground meats, gelatin, desserts, frozen vegetables. The freezer compartment, though small at first, allowed for long-term storage, something unheard of just a generation before. Meal planning changed. So did taste. Where food had once been chosen for its shelf stability, salted, dried, smoked, now freshness became the ideal. Cold, ironically, made freshness more common. In the 1940s and 50s, domestic science, often called home economics, embraced refrigeration as a symbol of modern womanhood. Magazines, radio programs, and cookbooks focused on how to organize your fridge, ideal temperature zones, safe thawing practices, weekly menus based on leftovers. Women were encouraged to be efficient, scientific, and hygienic. The fridge was not just a storage box, it was a laboratory. Contests were held for most beautiful refrigerator interior. Women sent photos to appliance companies showcasing their tidy rows of condiments and labeled jars. The cold, once a survival challenge, became a domestic aesthetic. As electric refrigeration took over, generations of knowledge became obsolete. No longer taught how to store butter in cold water, how to smell meat for spoilage, how to build a spring house, how to pack fish in salt, how to keep milk from curdling on hot days. Even the rituals vanished, the ice sign in the window, the cloth under the icebox to catch drips, the weekly scrub with vinegar and soda. The refrigerator was simpler, yes, but it made people forget the effort behind safety. Spoiled food now meant a broken appliance, not a broken process. Though the fridge improved lives, it came with unintended consequences. Freon and other CFCs, once celebrated, were later found to destroy the ozone layer. Discarded fridges became waste problems. Energy usage soared. Fridges are among the most power-hungry home appliances. Cold food replaced warm. Frozen dinners emerged, meals built for convenience, not nutrition. Supermarkets began selling pre-chilled everything, reducing local shopping. Rural preservation knowledge faded. The cold made life easier, but it also made it more homogeneous. Food from California tasted the same in Cleveland as in Boston. Regional differences dulled, and the work that went into preservation? Forgotten. In a strange twist, ice, once a struggle to obtain, returned as a luxury detail. Ice machines in hotels, cocktail bars with hand-carved cubes, chefs using dry ice for theatrical presentations, craft ice, clear spheres and cubes, sold in upscale supermarkets. Even the old aesthetic of the icebox has returned. Retro-style fridges with brass hinges and vintage handles are sold for thousands of dollars. The cold, once invisible, is now curated. But it's a performance, not a necessity. No one is hauling frozen blocks from a cart. No one is praying the melt holds until morning. We now choose when cold enters the room. It no longer demands our labor. In elderly homes across Britain, the US, and beyond, you can still find someone who remembers the old drip pan, the daily check, the smell when it was forgotten. They remember the iceman, his voice, his route, the way he leaned the block against the stoop. Some of them still feel odd leaving food uncovered, even in the fridge. They remember sweating over butter that had no chance in August. And when they hear the low hum of the fridge at night, some of them still glance toward it, waiting for a sound that never comes, the clink of tongs, the squeal of a cartwheel, the thump of the block. But all they hear is silence. And cold. Refrigeration brought relief, safety, convenience. It changed how we ate, planned, and lived. It made cold predictable. But something else disappeared with the icebox, the cellar, and the drip tray. The awareness of decay, the ritual of vigilance, the daily dance with spoilage. We no longer ask, will this last the night? Will the ice hold? Can this be saved? Instead, we close the door. The hum continues. And we forget. What else have we lost, now that we no longer wait for the ice to arrive? The morning whistle pierces the dark. It's 4:55 a.m. In the sorting room of the Norwich General Post Office, the air smells of coal, wet wool, and ink. Gaslights flicker overhead. Dozens of hands move in practiced rhythm, opening sacks, stamping letters, tying bundles. In the corner, a man laces up his boots, thick leather, polished but worn. He wraps a scarf around his neck and adjusts his canvas satchel. His coat bears the insignia of the General Post Office, GPO. This is Mr. William Hargreaves, postal deliverman. He has walked the same 10-mile route 6 days a week for 11 years. He is 43. His knees ache. His pace is steady. He will be on the street by 5:30, delivering the first of up to 6 daily postal rounds. In Edwardian England, the mail never sleeps. By the early 20th century, the British postal system was among the most advanced and demanding in the world. The General Post Office, GPO, was a vast bureaucracy employing over 250,000 people by 1910. Of these, a substantial portion were letter carriers, men and women walking, cycling, or riding to bring letters to nearly every door in the nation. Thanks to the penny post, introduced in 1840, sending a letter was cheap, 1 penny for any address in the UK, regardless of distance. As literacy rates rose and telephones remained expensive, letters became the default method of communication for love and courtship, business correspondence, family, news, legal documents, military updates. By 1900, the GPO handled over 5 billion postal items per year. Delivering them required a tightly organized army and grueling daily routines. Postmen like Mr. Hargreaves began their shift before sunrise. They reported to the sorting office around 4:30 to 5 a.m., where incoming mail from overnight trains was processed. The first delivery, known simply as the first post, was expected to reach homes by breakfast, especially in cities and market towns. Letters were sorted by hand. Bundles were wrapped in string and carried in oilcloth bags. Routes were walked on foot, often with military punctuality. A typical city postman might walk 8 to 12 miles per day, often returning to the office 2 or 3 times between rounds. Rain, snow, mud, all were ignored. The mail went through. A famous GPO motto read, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night." Though borrowed from Herodotus, the sentiment stuck. Postmen were not just employees. They were symbols of order. It's hard to imagine now, but in Edwardian England, some urban areas received as many as 6 mail deliveries per day, especially in business districts like London's Financial Quarter. The average household received 2 to 3 deliveries daily. First post. Early morning, second post. Mid-morning, third post. Afternoon. This rapid turnover meant that you could send a letter in the morning, receive a reply by the afternoon. It made postal correspondence as immediate as texting. Shops relied on it for inventory updates, families for scheduling visits, lovers for confirming meetings. The entire rhythm of city life danced to the footfalls of the postman. In country areas, the number of deliveries was lower, but even remote villages received at least 1 per day, often by bicycle, horseback, or foot. The postman's appearance was regulated, as much a matter of pride as practicality. Cap, embroidered with GPO in brass coat. Heavy wool, dyed navy blue trousers. Sturdy, with deep pockets boots. Government issue leather, ankle high, resold yearly bag. Canvas satchel with oilskin lining. A clean, polished uniform was not just expected, it was inspected. A scruffy postman might receive formal warnings, or in extreme cases, dismissal. The boots, Though sturdy, were unforgiving. Many men suffered from blisters, bunions, and chronic knee pain. Few retired without some limp or stiffness in their gait. But their pride was real. A postman was visible, respected, and trusted, especially in working-class neighborhoods. He was allowed to step over thresholds, to know names, to carry news both joyful and grim. Weather did not excuse delay. Instructions from the GPO were explicit. The letters must be delivered regardless of conditions, save in cases of severe public hazard or route obstruction. That meant deliveries in sleet and hail, long marches through flooded lanes, navigating icy stone steps in the dark. Each round was timed. A supervisor might walk the route behind the postman with a stopwatch. Late deliveries were logged and penalized. To meet these demands, many postmen memorized shortcuts through alleys, learned which gates squeaked and which dogs barked, practiced opening letterboxes silently to avoid waking households. The job demanded precision, repetition, and discretion. In an era without mobile phones or online tracking, the postman was more than a courier. He was a weather forecaster. Rains moving in over King's Lynn, looks like. A gossip conduit. Mrs. Appleton's daughter married a widower. 3 children already. A trusted eye for the elderly and the sick, a bearer of births and deaths, conscriptions and pardons in some towns. The postman was the first to know of affairs, bankruptcies, job offers, illnesses. He saw what came through the post. He saw who cried when they read it. And he kept silent. Because discretion was part of the uniform, too. What filled those satchels? Written in careful ink, folded in triplicate, sometimes scented with perfume, often urgent, apologetic, or hesitant, sent by telegram or letter, envelopes edged in black, opened slowly, then held with trembling hands. Tax demands, registration certificates, army orders, government leaflets, cheap, cheerful, and common. Travelers writing from Brighton or Scarborough. Messages were often as mundane as, weather fine, had fish, see you Monday. For the postman, these were not stories. They were items. But over time, patterns emerged. The house that got no letters. The widow who waited every day. The child who watched at the gate. The postman carried paper, but he also carried expectation. It was not an easy life. 6 days a week, up to 10 to 14 miles per day, minimal breaks, low pay. Often £1 per week, retirement after decades. Often without pension, illness was rarely excused. Injuries went untreated. Holidays were hard won. And yet, turnover was low. Why? Because the job came with dignity. The uniform mattered. The schedule, harsh as it was, offered stability. And in a world full of uncertainty, the postman was one of the few who always arrived. Before inboxes and status updates, there was the sound of boots on cobblestones. A knock, a letter, a nod. What does it say about a society when its most trusted figure is the one who brings the news, but never stops long enough to hear the reply? It is nearly midnight. Inside a red brick fortress of bureaucracy in Clerkenwell, hundreds of men in rolled-up sleeves pass letters along great wooden sorting frames. The air thrums with the noise of stamps, trolleys, and clattering carts. A clock rings each quarter hour. Nothing stops moving. This is Mount Pleasant, one of the largest postal sorting centers in the world. Every envelope, every parcel, every telegram that arrives in London by rail, ship, or cart is touched by human hands, examined, ordered, marked, bundled. Behind every postman's route is this unseen hive. Before a letter can be slipped into a brass slot in Norwich, it must be counted in London, thrown into a sack, and placed on a mail train roaring through the night. This is the machine beneath the morning knock. By 1910, Britain's postal system was inseparable from its rail network. Mail trains ran on fixed timetables, often given priority over passenger traffic. Entire carriages were dedicated to mailbags. Some trains had traveling post offices, TPOs, mobile sorting rooms where clerks processed letters en route. Station platforms had special hooks to catch mailbags mid-motion, allowing trains to deliver without stopping. From cities, bags were transferred to horse-drawn carts or early motor vans, then to regional sorting offices, and finally into the leather satchels of local postmen. A letter from London to Manchester could arrive within 24 hours, provided it caught the early collection. This staggering efficiency was powered by thousands of workers, many of them invisible to the public. The postman on the doorstep was the final link in a long bureaucratic chain. The GPO operated like a military body, with layers of authority: Postmaster General, a cabinet-level position; district superintendents sorting office foreman letter carriers; postmen, auxiliary and temporary staff. Every route was documented, every delay recorded. Promotions were slow, based on tenure and spotless conduct. Favoritism could delay advancement for years. Postmen could be established, permanent staff with benefits, or unestablished, casual laborers with no pension. Complaints from the public were logged in red-inked ledgers and could lead to disciplinary action, suspension, or dismissal. Even a misdelivered letter might result in a pay docking. The job offered stability, but also constant surveillance. Postmen were watched, in more ways than one. Supervisors occasionally shadowed carriers to ensure speed and accuracy. Public complaints were taken seriously, even when frivolous. Mystery letters were sometimes planted by supervisors to test honesty. Time checks were logged with wall-mounted clocks at major delivery checkpoints. The GPO was obsessed with efficiency and integrity. A stolen sixpence from a letter could become national news. A letter carrier's behavior, even off-duty, reflected on the service. Drinking in uniform was forbidden. Being seen with unsuitable company was discouraged. It was a life of public trust and private restraint. Though the archetype was male, women played a growing role in the Edwardian postal system. Postmistresses ran rural offices. Clerks and sorters in large cities were increasingly women. Female letter carriers existed, though rare, often in remote or hard-to-staff routes. Women were typically paid less, hired in subordinate roles, and often dismissed upon marriage. Yet during strikes, shortages, and especially World War I, they stepped in en masse. The Edwardian period saw early rumblings of gender reform in the post. Equal pay campaigns by the Fawcett Society, articles in the Woman's Post newsletter, quiet protests, such as pinning suffragette ribbons inside uniforms. For now, they remained second-class workers in a first-class system. But the thread had been pulled. Not every letter made it to its destination. Some were addressed poorly. Aunt Mary, that cottage by the bridge; Mr. Thomas, near the old church; Devon. Postmen often knew who was meant. But when they didn't, the letters went to the dead letter office, a branch of the GPO where undeliverable mail was opened, examined, and sometimes returned. Workers here had a unique task: to solve puzzles without ever speaking to the sender. They dealt with letters without stamps, parcels with broken seals, envelopes marked to be opened in case of death. Some found money inside. Others held pressed flowers, locks of hair, or cryptic notes. Once a month, the DLO destroyed thousands of these messages, ashes in the basement furnace. Most postmen followed the rules, but some pushed back. In 1890, thousands of letter carriers protested low pay, long hours, and poor treatment. Organized by the Postmen's Federation, they demanded reduced rounds, better uniforms, higher wages, recognition of their role as professionals. The strike spread across London and major cities. The public noticed. Deliveries stopped. Businesses panicked. The government cracked down, firing leaders and threatening arrests. Though the strike failed in the short term, it laid the groundwork for postal unions, the 1905 reclassification of postmen as civil servants, future labor reforms. It was a rare moment when the usually invisible backbone of communication made its voice heard. The letterbox, now a slot in the door or a metal box, became a national icon. Standardized in the 1850s, it evolved into wall-mounted boxes in rural areas, pillar boxes on street corners, door-mounted flaps in urban homes. Pillar boxes, painted pillar box red, became as British as fog and tea. Children eagerly checked them. Dogs barked at them. Courting couples wrote to them. Letters were not just messages. They were rituals, folded, carefully stamped with attention, walked to the box with hope. The postman, then, was not merely a deliveryman. He was the ritual's completion. The Edwardian postman carried more than mail. During outbreaks of influenza, cholera, or war, he brought death notices. Some people watched for his hat through lace curtains with dread. Others waited on the porch, hoping for news of a son abroad. He witnessed grief, proposal, betrayal, relief, but he could not stop. He had 5 more rounds, and a route to keep. Years later, after retirement or death, some postmen were remembered not by name, but by footstep. He was the one who always came before the church bell. She had the gray braid and the white gloves. He gave me my letter from the front. I never saw my brother again. The postman walked beside history, without ever becoming its subject. Every system has a pulse. In Edwardian England, it was the post, ticking forward in bags and boots, timetables and trolleys. It moved quietly, but relentlessly. And all across the country, people lived their lives by the sound of its rhythm. What happens to a society when the person it trusts most is expected never to slow down and never to speak? It's October, and the rain slicks the cobblestones. A postman, shoulders hunched under a soaked GPO coat, lifts the flap of a brass letterbox on Fleet Street. Inside, a letter, dry, white, wax-sealed, disappears into the darkness. He moves on. He has 43 more stops. The war has begun. All over Britain, letters now carry a different weight. Mothers dread them. Soldiers await them. Recruitment notices and ration books pass through the same red pillar boxes as love notes and birthday cards. The post still moves, but the world is shifting. The modern age has arrived, and with it, the beginning of the end for the old route, the old bag, and the slow, steady knock at the door. When World War I broke out in 1914, Britain's postal service faced immediate pressure. Millions of letters flooded between the front lines and the home front. Soldiers wrote daily, often from muddy trenches or field hospitals. Families sent newspapers, sweets, and socks in care parcels. The Army Postal Service was established, operating field post offices near battle zones. Trains, trucks, and horses carried mail in both directions, from Flanders to Liverpool, from Gallipoli to Glasgow. It was essential to morale. The GPO also managed censorship. Letters were opened, read, redacted. Any mention of troop movement or battlefield detail could be cut out with scissors. Soldiers learned to speak in code, vague phrases, hopeful euphemisms. I saw the birds fly low this morning, might mean we were shelled. But the letters kept coming. Even in war, the ritual endured. Back home, postmen were called up by the thousands. Their routes were reassigned or reduced. Women, previously barred from most delivery roles, were finally allowed to step in. For the first time, women carried the post bag. Women rang the bell. Women delivered death notices. And they did it well. Some towns were run almost entirely by female posties by 1917. Their uniforms were altered, skirts instead of trousers, but their routes and duties were the same. They were praised. Then, after the war, most were dismissed, sent back to private life, their places reclaimed by returning men. Still, something had shifted. The sound of the knock no longer belonged to one kind of boot. Though letters remained dominant, the telegram became the dark symbol of the war years. A slim envelope, delivered by hand. Few words, no emotion. Regret to inform you. Killed in action. No further details at present. The postman dreaded delivering them. Families feared their approach. The telegram severed the relationship between message and ritual. It didn't wait. It didn't knock. It didn't pause on the mat. It was urgent, clinical, and final. This was the future of communication. Faster, colder, less human. After the war, the GPO entered a new phase. It was no longer just a mail service. It became a communications empire. It controlled telegraph lines. It launched the Post Office Savings Bank. It introduced radio licensing and managed early telephone exchanges. Meanwhile, automation crept into sorting rooms. Electric conveyor belts, mechanical stamp cancelers, trials of pneumatic tubes for internal post. Trains still carried mail, but cars and lorries became more common. In cities, the delivery bike replaced the foot patrol, and slowly, routes shrank. Letter frequency fell. The 6 daily deliveries became 3, then 2, then 1. By the 1930s, the postman no longer arrived before breakfast. In rural areas, postmen held out longest. In Yorkshire Dales, Welsh villages, Scottish islands, they still trudged miles over fields and hills, delivering to outposts that saw no other visitor. Children knew them by name. Dogs recognized their steps. They carried not just mail, but supplies, newspapers, even medicine in emergencies. But with road improvements came vans. The foot postman became rare. Routes were consolidated. Stops were centralized. The man who once walked 10 miles a day now sat behind a steering wheel. Convenient? Yes. But something was lost. The familiarity of footfall, the pause at the gate, the rhythm of a neighborhood shaped by a walking figure in blue by the mid-20th century. The idea of the personal postman was fading. Urbanization meant more doors, more flats, more locks. The post was still delivered, but less often by someone you knew. Uniforms were more functional, less formal. Routes rotated more frequently. Conversations shortened. Meanwhile, advertising mail, circulars, promotions, catalogs began filling mailbags. The personal letter, once the bread and butter of the system, became rare. By the 1960s, mail was increasingly predictable, institutional, automated. The postman had not vanished, but he had become less visible. Even as the postman faded from daily prominence, his image grew stronger in memory. Books, films, and children's TV shows kept him alive. The gentle postman Pat, delivering in the Dales with Jess the Cat, memoirs of wartime delivery novels featuring lost letters, found hearts. Faithful couriers, he became a symbol of community, of duty, of things done properly. People remembered his punctuality, his decency, the sound of the latch they forgot. The pain in his knees, the rules he followed, the weight of grief in his bag. Nostalgia polished the buttons, but it rarely opened the satchel. Today, postal service continues, though shaped by new forces. Online shopping, parcel delivery giants, digital communication. The letterbox is still there. The red postbox still stands, but they fill more slowly now. The postal worker remains essential, especially in remote communities, during crises, and for those still unplugged from digital life. But the quiet, rhythmic walk, the 6 daily knocks, the warm nod across a fence, those belong to another world. A slower one, a more attentive one, and one that was, for over a century, shaped by the sound of boots, a leather satchel, and the careful placement of a single envelope. Before smartphones, inboxes, and digital alerts, a nation depended on a man or a woman with a bag, a list, and a route. They didn't ask for thanks. They didn't linger. They simply walked. And in that slow, steady path, they stitched together a country. One envelope at a time. We still get mail. But do we still listen for the knock? It's morning in the city of Uruk, and the sun rises over walls of mud brick and reed. In a modest courtyard, surrounded by low stone benches and open drains, a young man kneels beside a low table. He holds a fresh lump of clay, damp, cool, and beige. He smooths it into a rectangle, not much larger than a hand. With a stylus made of cut reed, he begins to press small wedge-shaped marks into the surface. One by one, deliberate, practiced. It's a transaction. 6 jars of barley from Temple Storehouse, 3 to Farmer Ishkur. He's not a priest, not a merchant, not a king. He's a clerk. And in this world, that means he is essential. Writing did not emerge as poetry or prayer. It began as inventory. In the fertile plains of Sumer, modern-day Iraq, early city-states thrived. With fertile soil, irrigated fields, and dense populations, there came a problem. How do you keep track of everything? Who paid their temple taxes? Who owned which plot of land? How many sheep were collected last season? The answer was to write it down. But there was no paper, no ink, no alphabet. There was clay, reed, and the cuneiform script, a system of wedge-like marks pressed into mud tablets and dried in the sun. And there were people to do the pressing. The tools of a Mesopotamian scribe were simple: stylus, a sharpened reed, often notched or flattened at the tip; clay tablets, roughly palm-sized, freshly moistened each morning; water bowl, to keep clay pliable and to wash hands; tablet rack, for drying and storing finished records; seals, cylinder seals rolled across wet clay to verify authorship. A good scribe could write dozens of tablets per day, each one a contract, receipt, or inventory. Training began in childhood. Boys, and some rare girls, studied in adubas or scribal schools, where they copied standard phrases over and over. 2 goats to the temple. 1 basket of dates from Enlil's granary. Mistakes meant beatings. Accuracy was survival. Everything. In an early city like Ur or Lagash, you might find thousands of tablets recording. Rations issued to workers, daily grain allotments for livestock, tax payments in barley, wool, or oil, land leases, and tenancy contracts, temple donations, and sacrificial schedules. One famous collection from the city of Drayam, circa 2300 BC, records food deliveries to sacred cattle. Another, From Uruk, lists wages paid to female brewers, paid in beer and bread. Clerks also recorded births, marriages, lawsuits, deaths. In essence, they were the civil servants of the ancient world. They did not build the ziggurats or lead armies, but they made sure someone kept track of who did and who paid for it. Imagine our clerk, Naram Sin, in the year 2140 BCE. He wakes with the sun. His room is small, bare walls, woven mats. He eats stale barley bread dipped in date syrup. He walks through dusty alleys to the temple office, where stacks of clay tablets rest under a reed awning. There, a priest hands him a fresh order. The governor is donating silver to the harvest festival. Write the receipt. Make 2 copies. Naram Sin writes slowly. The priest watches. When finished, Naram rolls his cylinder seal across the tablet. A small carved stone that leaves a unique imprint, his signature. The tablet is left to dry in the sun. By midday, Naram has recorded. For goat deliveries, a dispute over irrigation ditches, a debt repayment of 3 minas of copper. He ends the day with inkless fingers and sore knees. You might imagine ancient records were fragile and lost. But clay, once baked, is nearly indestructible. As a result, the cities of Mesopotamia have yielded hundreds of thousands of tablets, many preserved by accident when fires hardened them. Some storage rooms were simple pits, wooden shelves, temple archives sealed with wax and rope. These were the first filing cabinets. Some were labeled with reed tags. Others were cataloged by memory, each clerk knowing which pile held which month's will transactions. Mistakes were rare. There were no erasers. If you made an error, you discarded the tablet, rewrote it from scratch, and hoped the kiln fire didn't crack the clay. The Mesopotamian state used its bureaucracy to maintain order. Temple economies operated with detailed records of labor, taxes, and surplus. Royal courts tracked tributes, punishments, and land ownership. Military officials maintained lists of conscripted men and supplies. A missing goat could lead to punishment. An extra basket of dates, unrecorded, might imply theft. Bureaucracy meant hierarchy, surveillance, predictability, and for rulers like Hammurabi, it became ideology. His famous law code wasn't just a list of rules. It was a public document, carved into stone and displayed in temples. Paperwork had become political. Though much of what survives is dull, receipts, quotas, and taxes, some tablets reveal personalities. A letter from a scribe complains of bad beer served at a festival. A marriage contract includes a clause that the husband must bathe weekly. A grain record ends with a note. Overseer added Arab has lied. Clerks, for all their orderliness, lived in the same world of noise, sweat, and frustration as anyone else. They got tired. They gossiped. They scratched notes in the margins. They knew that behind every number was a person, a farmer late on rent, a priest exaggerating his flock, a widow arguing over wool. And they recorded it all. Without these mud clerks, there would have been no accurate harvests, no tax collection, no centralized religion, no law enforcement, no monuments with names. Their tablets told kings where to build canals, told temples how much surplus to sacrifice, told future generations how their society functioned. And when empires fell, when Sumer gave way to Akkad, and Akkad to Babylon, the clerks remained. New languages, new kings, same clay, same stylus. The bureaucracy outlasted the crown. We remember the kings of Mesopotamia. We marvel at their ziggurats and codes. But it was the clerks, the quiet ones with sore backs and careful hands, who kept the world from dissolving into chaos. In a civilization built on floodplains and faith, it was the pressed wedge and mud that made it all real. What does it mean when the most important people in a society never leave their desks? The air is heavy with the scent of old grain and damp clay. Rows of sealed jars line a stone storeroom under the temple of Enlil. Beside each jar is a clay tablet, small, hand-sized, marked with cuneiform. A clerk sits at a wooden bench under a flickering oil lamp. He turns the tablets over, squinting. His task is simple: match the contents of each jar to its record. One jar has too much barley. Another, not enough. He sighs and scratches his stylus into a new piece of clay. Tomorrow, the priests will come asking questions. And all that stands between them and chaos is the clerk's accuracy. Temples in Mesopotamia weren't just places of worship. They were grain silos, legal offices, tax collection centers, distribution hubs. The temple of a god like Enlil, Inanna, or Marduk might employ dozens of scribes, each responsible for a different set of resources. Livestock, textiles, perfume, oil, beer. The priests ran the rituals, but the scribes ran the records. Every donation, every withdrawal, every animal born or slaughtered was written into tablets. Temples amassed hundreds, sometimes thousands, of clay records, filed by month, product, or purpose. A misplaced tablet could mean theft. A miscounted sheep could become blasphemy. Paperwork, quite literally, kept the gods fed. Cuneiform wasn't a language. It was a script, used for multiple languages over time, including Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian. It consisted of wedge-shaped marks made by pressing, not carving, horizontal, vertical, and angled impressions. No punctuation or spacing to read a tablet. A clerk had to know the context, temple, business, legal, etc. The formula, standard openings and closings. The numerical system, base, 60 for some figures, base, 10 for others. For example, a simple ration tablet might read 5 gur of barley for the weavers, 7th month, from the temple granary. But others were longer, more complex. Lease agreements with terms of repayment, multi-person contracts with witnesses, inventories that spanned dozens of lines. Clerks didn't just record, they interpreted, organized, and reconciled. And they had to get it right the first time. There were no erasers in cuneiform. If you made a mistake, you squashed the tablet, smashed it while still wet, began again. If it was already dry or filed, a mistake could be serious. Some possible consequences: loss of pay, whipping for apprentices, temple penalty offerings for senior clerks, reputational damage within the scribal community. Errors had ripple effects. Incorrect tax ledgers could destabilize budgets. Missing livestock tallies could cause priestly disputes. Incorrect loan terms could lead to false imprisonment. The clerk lived under constant pressure, invisible unless wrong. To become a clerk, you needed schooling. Boys, and rarely girls, attended adubas or tablet houses from ages 8 to 14. Run by senior scribes, these schools were intense and often cruel. Lessons included copying standard model texts, memorizing lists of words, gods, kings, and professions, practicing numerals and weights, learning stylus technique. A typical assignment might be: write the tablet for 10 shekels of silver, lent with 1/6 interest over 1 year. Punishment for mistakes was swift. One surviving student text reads, "I spoke in class, and my teacher caned me. I was late, and he caned me. My handwriting was poor, and he caned me. But the reward was great." A trained scribe could serve in temple, palace, or private estate, gain a regular income, access legal and religious texts, be exempt from manual labor. They became the literate elite, though always in service of someone else's wealth. Among the most important roles of a clerk was recording law. Contracts were drawn for land leases, loans, marriage, dowries, slave sales, apprenticeships. Each tablet had the names of both parties, terms of the deal, witness names, often 2 to 4. The date, based on regnal year and city calendar. An official seal. Impression tablets were stored by parties or filed in temple or palace archives. Disputes were settled by reading the contract aloud, literally. One famous case from Sapar, 1890 BCE, includes, "This is the agreement. This tablet has not been tampered with. We read it in the presence of 3 witnesses. It stands." A clerk's integrity was as important as their legibility. They held power without authority, a dangerous, delicate balance. Though rare, women did appear in the scribal world. Some temples, especially those dedicated to goddesses like Inanna, employed priestesses who could write. Royal daughters were trained as scribes and administrators in elite households. A few contracts bear female signatures and seals, mostly related to land, dowries, or temple service. One scribe, Enhejoanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, is credited as the world's first named author, writing hymns and religious poetry around 2300 BC. Women were not common in bureaucracy, but they were not absent, and their presence reveals the permeability of even the strictest hierarchies in moments of crisis, inheritance, or divine service. Empires rose and fell. Sumerian gave way to Akkadian, to Babylonian, to Assyrian, to Persian. But the clerks remained. When cities burned, tablets were buried. When kings changed, laws were rewritten. But always, someone had to. Count the sheep, record the debt, tally the rations, stamp the receipt. They adapted, learn new scripts, switch languages. Some tablets are even bilingual, Sumerian and Akkadian side by side. These were not poets, not prophets. They were survivors of dust, flame, flood, and king. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered tens of thousands of tablets in ancient ruins. Lagash, Nippur, Nineveh, Babylon. They were found in heaps, under floors, in trash pits. Many bore no epic poems, no royal decrees, just ledgers, 17 baskets of onions, 3 jars of oil, rent owed from Ishtar's priest. Yet from these dusty records, we have reconstructed ancient economies, agricultural practices, class structures, laws. The mud clerk, anonymous and unsung, preserved civilization in the most mundane way, by never forgetting who owed what to whom. The earliest records of human thought are not grand philosophies or bold epics. They are inventory lists, tax logs, and temple receipts. What does that say about us? That perhaps civilization didn't begin with inspiration, but with administration. A scholar sits at a broad wooden desk beneath a clouded lamp. Before her are dozens of small, cracked objects, mud tablets, pulled from the earth near ancient Nippur. She turns one gently in her gloved hands, tracing the pressed wedges with her fingertips. The inscription is plain. It reads, "Received, 2 sheep, from the granary of Enlil, to be sacrificed. No names we recognize, no dates we can fully trust, no grandeur, just a transaction, preserved for 4,000 years. She smiles, because this, more than any crown or myth, tells her how people actually lived. The history we are taught often celebrates battles, kings, and monuments. But most of what we know about ancient Mesopotamia comes from the scribes, not the soldiers, not the rulers, but the record keepers. The grand myths, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, number in the dozens. But the administrative records? They number in the hundreds of thousands. Bureaucracy was not a sideshow. It was the structure of survival. It told the state who owed barley, whose field flooded when the taxes were due, how many oxen fed the temple priests. Without this knowledge, cities crumbled, temples emptied, armies starved. And so, the mud clerk, faceless, often unnamed, kept it all standing. Ancient Mesopotamia may have lacked paper, but it didn't lack systems. Temple archives were organized with surprising rigor. Tablets were grouped by purpose. Receipts, rations, loans, census. Many were dated by the regnal year, e.g. year Hammurabi built the canal. Some tablets were numbered, part of long accounting series. Labels made of clay or reeds marked shelves and containers. The ruins of Ebla, Mari, and Ur have yielded entire tablet libraries, one with over 20,000 entries. These were not haphazard piles. They were curated, updated, and managed. Even now, archaeologists often find tablets in logical order, as if the clerk had just stepped out to lunch. Clerks rarely issued commands, but they often interpreted them, turning royal edicts into practical policy. For example, a king might decree land redistribution. It was the clerks who measured plots, wrote contracts, and recorded disputes. Their handwriting and bias shaped who benefited. In this way, the bureaucracy had a quiet influence. A miscount could enrich a temple. A favorable report could protect a village. A footnote could cause a war. And while their decisions rarely made history books, they made history happen from the bottom up. One remarkable feature of Mesopotamian bureaucracy is that mistakes lasted forever. Once baked, a clay tablet couldn't be edited. Unlike paper, it couldn't be burned quickly or erased with ink. Thus, a false number, a misspelled name, a forged seal, all were permanent. This permanence meant that clerks became increasingly conservative. Verification rituals evolved, second signers, official witnesses, duplication of records. Legal disputes often came down to tablet interpretation. Even today, modern scholars spend years debating ambiguous tablets, unsure if a confusing clause is due to poor handwriting, missing context, or ancient clerical error. Time has not softened their precision. With its desks, inkless paperwork, chain of command, and storage systems, the Mesopotamian temple or palace office was not unlike a modern bureaucratic department. It featured clerks of different ranks, Junior scribes, recorders, senior archivists shift work. Clerks rotated according to lunar calendars and temple festival specializations. Grain clerks, animal clerks, tax clerks, court scribes. One scribe might never see a battlefield. Yet he would know how much silver came from conquests, what the soldiers ate, who paid for the king's horses. They were data processors, logisticians, financial analysts, before those terms existed. And like today, they often had no say in policy, but kept it functioning. It would be wrong to think of the scribes as soulless calculators. Many were also. Historians, priests, poets, teachers. Some temple libraries included myths, omens, hymns, proverbs, and riddles, all copied by scribes. A junior clerk might spend his mornings counting oxen and his evenings writing. If a man's dreams are full of falling stars, he will receive an unexpected letter. Or, the fox may cheat the lion, but the clerk cheats them both, with numbers. Even humor survives. One tablet records a clerk writing, "The grain arrived early this season. I suspect it was afraid of being counted." They were workers, yes, but also witnesses to life's absurdities. Paper burns, ink fades, but clay, if dried or fired, can last millennia. Today, thousands of ancient tablets are housed in the British Museum, the Louvre, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. Some sit in university basements, still untranslated. Others have been sold into private hands, divorced from their archaeological context. Each one holds a sliver of an ordinary day. 3 ducks, temple of Inanna. Loan, 8 shekels of silver, due next full moon. Complaint, neighbor's goat destroyed barley field. And each was written by a person we will never know, but who knew that someone might someday need to remember. From clay to paper to digital forms, the structure of record keeping remains largely the same. Input data, verify data, store data, retrieve on request. We still file taxes, track shipments, record minutes, issue receipts, and we still rely on those who process, manage, and preserve the flow, even if we don't remember their names. Today's digital clerks, database administrators, payroll officers, compliance analysts, work in quieter rooms with faster tools. But they face the same pressure. Get it right, don't be seen, don't make errors. We live in a world built on information, as surely as Uruk was built on clay. The mud clerks of Mesopotamia didn't write epic tales of heroes. They didn't invent gods or topple cities. They counted jars. They marked tablets. They stacked them in rows. But in doing so, they created something vast, the habit of remembering, not by memory, but by system. Civilization is not held together by generals or kings. It's held together by those who write things down and make sure they're in the right pile. They were never famous, but they were never forgotten, because they made forgetting impossible. The fog settles low over the soil, clinging to the coarse wool of a man's coat. He walks the edge of his field, boots caked with damp clay, and stops beside a plot lined not with wheat, but with rows of squat, leafy plants. He kneels, grips one by the stems, and pulls. A turnip, firm, cold, purple-topped. Behind him, his neighbor shakes his head. You'll never get sheep to eat that muck. But the man, a modest farmer named Charles, isn't worried. He's been reading about crop rotations and soil restoration. He's trying something new. And though no one knows it yet, this humble turnip will become a symbol of change, one that took over a century to be noticed. When we say revolution, we think of muskets, barricades, declarations. But the British Agricultural Revolution, which spanned roughly from 1700 to 1850, had no battles, no manifestos, no clear starting point. Instead, it crept through hedgerows, hedged its bets in seed drills, and whispered itself into the diaries of gentlemen farmers. It was a revolution of fallow fields, reclaimed crop yields, incrementally improved land enclosed, measured, and reorganized labor routines reshaped over generations, and at the center of it, often overlooked, sat the turnip. Not the most glamorous vegetable, but perhaps one of the most quietly transformative. Before the so-called revolution, English agriculture was seasonal, communal, exhausting. Most villages followed a 3-field system. 1/3 of the land grew wheat or rye, 1/3 grew barley or legumes, 1/3 lay fallow, rested to recover nutrients. Cattle grazed on common lands. Fertilizer meant manure, often scarce. Crops were rotated slowly and predictably. Yields were low, One seed of wheat might yield 5 in return. A bad harvest could lead to hunger, or worse. Labor was organized communally. Land was often open, long strips shared among tenants and landowners. But by the 17th century, that was beginning to change. Landowners, looking to increase profit, began experimenting, and a few eccentric noblemen picked up the plow themselves. One such man was Charles Townshend, 1674 to 1738, later nicknamed Turnip Townshend. A former diplomat and aristocrat, Townshend retired to his Norfolk estate and became obsessed with improving agriculture. His favorite tool? The four-field system: wheat, turnips, barley, clover, or ryegrass. This rotation had multiple benefits. No fallow land. Each field was used annually. Turnips and clover replenished nitrogen in the soil. Livestock grazed on clover and ate turnips during winter. Their manure fertilized the next crop. In effect, this was a closed-loop system, and it worked. Townshend evangelized the method in pamphlets, letters, and lectures. He turned his estate into a demonstration plot. Yet few small farmers copied him. Why? Because they couldn't afford to, and they didn't trust it. Even when Townshend and others proved that turnips improved soil and supported winter livestock feeding, adoption remained slow. Reasons included: turnips required fencing to keep animals out. Most land was still communally owned or used. Harvesting turnips by hand was labor-intensive. Many farmers didn't eat turnips themselves. Only animals did. Cultural suspicion. New crops felt foreign or untrustworthy. It wasn't until the broader Enclosure Acts gained ground in the late 18th century that these reforms took root. When land was consolidated, large landowners could rotate crops efficiently, fence their property, control grazing schedules, invest in tools like Jethro Tull's seed drill. But for small farmers and rural laborers, enclosure often meant displacement. Innovation came, but not without cost. The enclosure movement was a centuries-long process, accelerating between 1750 and 1830. Parliament passed thousands of private acts allowing landowners to consolidate common and open fields, fence or hedge their land, evict or buy out smaller tenants, control who farmed what, and how. Enclosure led to more efficient agriculture, increased yields from better management, a decline in communal village life. It also created a rural underclass. Laborers with no land, former smallholders forced into wage work, rising migration to cities. The turnip thrived, but so did inequality. With turnips now widely grown, winter farming changed. Previously, farmers had to slaughter livestock before winter due to lack of fodder. But turnips could be stored underground, be fed raw, or cooked to cattle and sheep support animals through the winter. This led to year-round manure production, more robust spring plowing, improved meat and dairy output. In essence, the humble root became a nutrient bridge between seasons. Suddenly, farming wasn't about surviving the winter, it was about planning for it. This shift in mindset, more than any one crop, marked the revolution. With crop rotation came record-keeping. Estate managers now tracked crop yields by acre, livestock births and feed ratios, manure application schedules, labor wages across seasons. Ledgers became as important as plows. The new model required literacy, patience, long-term thinking. It was bureaucratic farming, deliberate, measured, data-driven. And it favored those with larger estates, clerical support, capital to wait for slow gains. The revolution was not in the soil alone. It was in how the soil was measured. By the mid-1800s, the results were clear. Britain had higher yields per acre than ever before. Fewer people produced more food. Cities were fed by rural reforms. Meat and dairy became staples, not luxuries. But this wasn't sudden. A farmer in 1710 might not notice the difference between his field and his father's, nor might his son. But his grandson? He'd be farming enclosed land, rotating crops, feeding sheep on clover, and keeping careful notes. And he'd be planting turnips, not because he read a pamphlet, but because everyone else did. The change, when it came, felt like tradition. Not all revolutions are loud. Some arrive one furrow at a time. Not with fire, but with fertilizer. Not with speeches, but with better fodder. What does it mean when a revolution takes 100 years and no one notices until the next generation is already eating it? A crowd gathers outside the church. Tacked to the wooden notice board, a parchment declares the land to be hereby enclosed under parliamentary authority. It is written in legal hand, signed by landowners, and unread by many of the men staring at it. They know what it means. It means the end of the commons. It means fences. It means rules. It means someone else now controls what had once been shared. And somewhere, in a warm drawing room, a gentleman farmer is measuring turnip yields with satisfaction. For centuries, rural England had operated on a semi-communal agricultural system. Common land allowed villagers to graze livestock, gather firewood, or glean after harvest. Open fields were divided into strips. Families had scattered plots amid shared pasture and fallow land. Rights were based on custom, not contracts. There was no central plan and little need for one. This created a delicate, flexible social web. Rich and poor shared responsibility for fallowing, fencing, and timing the plow. Elders passed down unwritten rules. Harvests were variable, but so were expectations. But the commons had a problem. It wasn't profitable, at least not to landowners. Between 1760 and 1820, over 3,500 enclosure acts passed through Parliament, transforming more than 6 million acres of land. The process worked like this: a landowner or group petitioned for enclosure. Parliament passed a private act legalizing it. Commissioners were appointed to survey, divide, and reallocate land. Boundaries were drawn, often with stone walls, hedgerows, or ditches. The result? Open fields were carved into geometric plots. Footpaths vanished, replaced by private lanes. Rights to the commons were nullified. Landless laborers and smallholders were pushed out. The land became more productive, but also more exclusive. With enclosure came measurement, and with measurement came records. Landowners kept crop rotation schedules, livestock, grazing plans, labor contracts, and wage rolls, rent rolls for tenant farms. This era birthed the estate manager, a professional overseer who balanced productivity and profit. He was part clerk, part agriculturalist, part negotiator. He knew when to plant clover, how many pigs a field could support, what the market paid for barley in London. His tool wasn't the hoe or scythe. It was the ledger book, the true plow of the revolution. For small farmers and cottagers, the changes were slow but relentless. Enclosure often promised fair division, but compensation went to landowners, not tenants. Many lost grazing rights they'd depended on for generations. Some were forced to rent the land they once accessed freely. Others became wage laborers on farms they'd once worked independently. A man who once tended 5 sheep and a garden patch now pushed a wheelbarrow for 6 pence a day. They didn't move at first. They adapted, until they couldn't. Then, over time, they left. This was rural depopulation by accountancy. Why did the turnip matter here? Because it enabled enclosure to be economically viable. It supported livestock through winter, making year-round animal farming profitable. That livestock produced manure, improving next season's crops. Enclosed fields made crop rotation predictable and efficient. Profits rose, not dramatically, but consistently. In economic terms, more food was produced on less land. Fewer laborers were needed per acre. Grain prices fell, supporting urban growth. But none of this felt like a revolution to the displaced. To them, it felt like the shrinking of the countryside. Turnips, clover, and enclosure weren't just economic. They were cultural changes. Many laborers resisted them quietly, mocked newfangled crops as tasteless, refused to eat turnips, viewing them as pig food, referred to clover as the devil's weed, told tales of witch-fenced fields, where spirits walked. Resistance was rarely open. But it was persistent. Some pulled up hedges at night, others grazed animals. Secretly, local priests or schoolmasters were shunned if they supported enclosure, and yet, each year, more fences went up. More common land disappeared. Folklore turned to silence. By the early 1800s, rural England was more productive and more unequal. Labor wages stagnated, even as profits rose. Rural poverty increased, with parish relief becoming widespread. Child labor became a feature of enclosed farms, thinning turnips, picking stones. Migration to cities grew, fueling the Industrial Revolution. Enclosure didn't cause the factories, but it filled them. And while agriculture improved, its human cost was paid in. Lost access, lost autonomy, lost connection to land. The old world had not disappeared, but it had been divided and rented back. From the perspective of the landed gentry, these changes were rational. Ledgers showed increased yields. Estate maps confirmed tidy boundaries. Labor was more controllable. Profits were more predictable. Many believed they were doing good, civilizing the countryside, bringing order to chaos. Pamphlets from the period speak of improving the moral fiber of the peasant class through routine. They saw turnips not as symbols of oppression, but as proof of progress. They didn't see the footpaths vanish, or the commons emptied, or the silence that followed. Because silence wasn't recorded in the ledger, the turnip brought no riots, no marches, no slogans. But it helped enclose a country, not with iron or law, but with yield charts and field borders. What do we lose when we measure land only by its productivity, and never by who walked it freely? The steam train hums gently as it cuts through the countryside. Through the window, the landscape rolls past, a patchwork of tidy, hedged fields stretching to the horizon. Each square is clean, regular, and enclosed. Sheep dot some of them. Others lie bare, but rich with dark soil. A man in the carriage watches. He's a surveyor, and he marvels at how perfectly ordered the fields appear. He has no memory of the commons. He was born after the hedges were raised. To him, this has always been the shape of England. But behind every fence lies a story of eviction, of yield, of progress, and of the turnip. By the mid-19th century, the British countryside had become a different world. It was efficiently partitioned, heavily recorded, technically advanced by the standards of its time. Quietly unequal the reforms of the previous 150 years, from the four-field rotation to the enclosure of land, had produced higher agricultural output, a surplus of laborers, lower rural incomes, a nation increasingly fed by fewer people, and all of this, in turn, supported the growth of cities, the expansion of industry, the rise of consumer society. Turnips didn't start the Industrial Revolution, but they made it possible. The principles that governed rotated farming began to shape other aspects of life. Think of it. Predictable cycles, measured input and output, waste reabsorbed as resource, human labor folded into a closed system. This logic, the rotational economy, echoed later in factory work schedules, urban sanitation systems, food supply chains, school calendars, tied to agricultural patterns. The countryside became not just the breadbasket, but the prototype for a society built on measured productivity. And the humble turnip? It taught people that even in winter, the soil could work, if organized correctly. Behind this transformation stood not generals or kings, but estate managers, surveyors, clerks, and land agents, gentlemen farmers with notebooks they kept. Weather logs, yield diaries, crop experiment notes, breeding records. Most of these men are forgotten. Their papers sit in county archives, their handwriting fading. But through quiet, boring work, they transformed land into data. And once something becomes data, it becomes power. This shift, from land as heritage to land as measurable commodity, defined the British Empire's rise in the 19th century. As rural workers lost access to land, many moved to towns and cities. By 1850, more than half of England's population lived in urban areas. Former field laborers worked in textile mills, coal pits, dockyards. Their diets changed. More bread, tea, beer, and yes, turnips. In fact, turnips became a cheap staple for the poor, a common ingredient in soups and stews, a symbol of working-class nutrition. What had once seemed foreign and untrustworthy became ordinary. And the workers who ate them rarely knew that it was the turnip, planted generations before, that had helped displace their ancestors. As the countryside became more orderly, it also became more idealized. Artists painted rolling fields, gentle hedgerows, sheep grazing in golden light. Poets romanticized the honest plowman and ancient oaks. But the real plowman now worked under contract, in fields he didn't own, planting crops he couldn't afford to eat. And the ancient oaks were often cleared to make way for straight-edged plots. This was manufactured nostalgia, a longing for a version of the countryside that had never quite existed. It soothed the conscience of landowners. It sold postcards, but it did not tell the truth. By the late 19th century, agriculture had become increasingly scientific. Soil chemistry identified which minerals improved which crops, selective breeding improved livestock and grain yield. State reports and journals spread best practices, and yet, the traditional village farmer, once a staple of English identity, was vanishing. In his place stood the tenant farmer, beholden to landlords and markets, the day laborer, seasonal and uncertain, the agricultural scientist. Clipboard in hand, the countryside now served a purpose: to feed the city, fuel the empire, and keep up with demand. Individual autonomy gave way to systems, to schedules, to quotas. Despite its central role, the turnip remains uncelebrated, mildly comedic, associated with bland meals and school lunches, and yet it appears in World War I trench songs, children's rhymes, county fairs, and vegetable competitions. It is the punchline of jokes, the symbol of peasantry, and a relic of transformation. No statue marks the turnip revolution. No memorial bears its dates. But its roots run through modern agriculture, the shape of the English countryside, the structure of modern rural economies. In that sense, it is perhaps the most British revolution of all, polite, slow, indirect, and quietly irreversible. It taught us that change doesn't always feel like change. Revolutions can be incremental, boring, and effective. What feeds us may also displace us. Systems that seem natural may be designed, enforced, and forgotten, and perhaps most of all, that even the most ordinary things, like a root vegetable, can alter the course of history when paired with enough paperwork and a long enough timeline. No blood was spilled, but lives were uprooted. No cities burned, but villages emptied. And no trumpets were sounded, but hedgerows marched across the land, quiet, green walls of economic logic. Not all revolutions come with noise. Some come in rows, planted, not shouted, measured, not declared, and by the time they bloom, the world has already changed. The next time you see a turnip, think of the fences behind it. The bell tolls, once, slowly, echoing off cold stone walls. In a narrow cell, a monk opens his eyes in darkness. He cannot see the walls. He doesn't need to. He knows them. He knows the steps to the chapel, the echo of his sandals on the slate floor, the creak of the wooden choir stall as he kneels. It is matins, the first of 8 daily offices. The candle he lights is short, marked in lines, and will burn precisely the right length. He begins to chant. Outside, the world sleeps. But inside, the hours are already being counted, not by machines, but by wax and willpower. In the medieval monastery, time was not money. It was devotion. Rooted in the rule of Saint Benedict, most Western monks followed a strict routine based on 8 canonical hours. Matins, middle of the night; lauds, before sunrise; prime, first hour after sunrise; terce, third hour; sext, sixth hour; midday; none, ninth hour; mid-afternoon; vespers, sunset; compline, nightfall. These were not just prayer sessions. They were time itself, dividing the day into sacred slices. Everything else, work, sleep, meals, happened around them. Timekeeping, then, was not mechanical. It was monastic. Before mechanical clocks, monasteries used natural rhythms and manual tools to mark the hours. Common methods included water clocks, clepsydras, bowls filled with water that dripped steadily into another vessel; marked candles, measured to burn for a known duration, often with hourly marks scored into the wax sundials. Useful only in daylight, and variable by season; observation of stars, shadows, and sunrise. A candle might burn for 4 hours, with notches showing half-hour intervals. Night prayers were timed by watching how far the wax had melted. When the candle reached the final mark, it was time for lauds. Time, in this world, was a visible flame, always moving toward darkness. The monastic schedule was designed not for comfort, but for discipline. A typical day: rise at 2:30 a.m. for matins, short rest, then lauds at dawn, prime followed by labor, gardening, copying manuscripts, cooking, meals in silence, with one monk reading aloud; terce, sext, and none punctuating work; vespers at sunset; compline after nightfall; sleep, broken, brief, blessed; silence was strict. Meals were plain. Movement was limited. To many, it would seem boring. But to the monks, it was liberation, freedom from distraction, from sin, from the noise of the world. In the monotony, they saw God. The monastic candle was more than a timepiece. It was a symbol of light against darkness, a measure of obedience, a sacrifice. Since wax was expensive, a tool, precise and practical. Candles were often made from beeswax, preferred for its clean burn, cast in iron molds scored with burn lines to indicate passing time, mounted in wind-protected holders. Some monasteries trained a specific monk, the custos horologi, to watch and trim candles, relight wicks, and record when to ring bells. Errors were taken seriously. A candle burned too fast, the office came early. Too slow, A sin of sloth might creep in. To the modern mind, this life seems agonizingly repetitive. But repetition was the point. Monks believed. Simplicity quieted the soul, routines fought temptation, boredom was spiritual training in their world. Excitement was a danger, linked to pride, distraction, lust, and worldliness. Some monastic writers even praised the holy boredom of long hours in the scriptorium, copying the same texts in silence. In the quiet labor of ink and parchment, the mind is shaped as the body once was in the field. They called it anamnesis, remembrance through routine. Each prayer, each copied line, each tick of wax, a chisel reshaping the soul. Candles bent, wicks sputtered, water clocks froze, bells broke. When time failed, so did the rhythm of life. Monasteries had contingency plans. Senior monks counted chance to estimate time, others watched the stars if uncertain. They prayed anyway. God, they reasoned, would understand. In deep winter, timing became guesswork. Yet they maintained the rhythm with astonishing consistency. A monk in York and a monk in Florence might chant none within minutes of each other, centuries before accurate mechanical clocks. How? Because they shared the same discipline, not the same devices. Between prayers, monks worked. Tasks included tending gardens and livestock, brewing beer and making cheese, illuminating manuscripts, repairing tools and buildings, serving the poor or sick. Even these were time-bound. You didn't just work, you worked until the bell. Then, you stopped, washed your hands, and walked to choir. It was not a matter of feeling done. It was about obedience to time. One monk wrote, "We serve not the task, but the hour. The hour belongs to God." No matter how compelling the work, a vine ripening, a sentence half finished, it was the hour that commanded. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, mechanical clocks began to appear in Europe, in cathedrals, monasteries, and town halls. They brought gears, bells, escapements, an entirely new relationship with time. Some monks embraced them. Others feared them. One abbot in Paris called them marvels of brass and pride. They ring without soul. Still, the clocks were built. Bells tolled automatically. Candles were used less. And with that shift, time slowly moved from the sacred to the secular. It became external, inflexible, measurable by all. And the candle, once the quiet heart of the monastic day, became quaint. Before time became a number on your wrist or screen, it was a flickering line on wax, watched by a sleepy monk who counted its burn to know when to pray. What happens when we no longer feel time, but only read it? It's the 6th hour, sext. The midday bell has not yet rung. A monk sits in a cold stone room, hunched over a manuscript. His hand trembles slightly as he guides the quill, dipping it in ink, then pulling it across parchment. He is copying a psalter for the 3rd time this year. The letters are familiar. The spacing is ritual. He does not pause to think, only to breathe and blink. Behind him, the candle drips down to another marked line. Soon, the bell will toll, and he will stop. Not because the work is finished, it never is, but because the hour has ended. Monks did not have jobs in the modern sense, but they had labors, organized by skill, season, and obedience. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized ora et labora, prayer and work, as the twin pillars of monastic life. Time was not something to use. It was something to fill with purpose. Each hour was defined, named, blessed. Between the canonical hours, the monks dug fields, baked bread, copied texts, made tools, crafted candles. Every act, even stirring the soup, was done under the awareness that time was not theirs. It belonged to God. The scriptorium was the heart of intellectual labor. It was a room, often cold and poorly lit, lined with desks angled to hold parchment. Tasks included copying scripture, transcribing saints' lives, illuminating manuscripts with colored ink and gold leaf, binding books with leather and thread. It was quiet, except for the scratching of quills. Time passed slowly here. Some monks copied just 3 or 4 pages per day. An illuminated Bible might take years. Fatigue was common. Mistakes, permanent. Margins sometimes include comments. This parchment is hairy. Let the reader forgive this dull letter. Oh, my hand. Still, the work was considered holy, not because of what it produced, but because of how it was done, patiently, obediently, humbly. Outside, other monks worked the gardens, equally bound by time. Tasks followed the liturgical calendar. spring, planting herbs, greens, and legumes summer, gathering honey, haying the fields autumn, harvesting apples, drying herbs winter, tending sheep, fixing tools, preparing wax gardens were often arranged according to symbolic geometry, crosses, circles, or quadrants. Even the choice of plants had meaning. Lavender for calm rue for penance beads and onions for the infirmary. Monks recorded planting cycles on wax tablets or in marginal notes beside psalms. The land, like the soul, was cultivated in seasons. Mealtimes were rigidly scheduled, often following nun, mid-afternoon prayer, and compline, evening prayer. The food was simple: grains, legumes, vegetables, fish seasonal, stored roots in winter, greens in spring regulated. No meat from four-legged animals. Unless ill, monks ate in silence. A designated reader recited scripture or saints' lives from a pulpit. Meals were timed, not by hunger, but by candle or bell. Even fasting was regulated by time: Lent, Advent, Ember days, and carefully measured. A late meal was considered a kind of gluttony. An early one, a sign of impatience. Food, like labor, belonged to the schedule. While candles marked the passage of time, the bell ruled it. The bell, called the monks to prayer, announced the canonical hours, signaled meals, chapter meetings, and bedtime was sometimes rung through the night for long vigils. Each monastery had a bell tower and a designated bell ringer, a trusted monk trained to maintain the flow of the day. Ring it early? The whole order was rushed. Ring it late? Sloth, confusion, even doctrinal anxiety. One 12th century chronicle records a monk weeping after miscounting the tolls during sext. I struck the 6th hour not at the sun's height, but at its fall. God forgive me. In a world built on routine, the bell was not a tool. It was law. It is easy to romanticize this life: the candles, the manuscripts, the stillness. But for many monks, boredom was a constant challenge. In fact, medieval texts frequently warn against aesthesia, a kind of spiritual listlessness or monastic melancholy. Symptoms included drowsiness during prayers, impatience during readings, a desire to be elsewhere, a gnawing sense that none of it mattered. Aesthesia was not laziness. It was a soul's weariness of repetition. Monks were trained to resist it by meditating on mortality, confessing small failures, redirecting focus to the task at hand. As one monk wrote, "When the hour drags, it is not the hour's fault. It is mine." Every monastery had one or more monks responsible for maintaining the calendar, not just the hours, but the feast days, fasts, and seasonal rituals. This role was part librarian, part meteorologist, part priest. He would record eclipses, solstices, harvest dates, track saints' days, and local observances, maintain customaries. Books listing the monastery's unique schedules. These records were never standardized. Each monastery had its own rhythm, shaped by climate, tradition, and leadership. Yet the system worked. Across Europe, thousands of monasteries rang bells, chanted psalms, and burned candles, in harmony with one another, yet never exactly the same. Time, in this world, was a local truth. Despite its rigidity, monastic timekeeping was always vulnerable. A storm might delay matins. A failed harvest might shorten the fasting schedule. A sick abbot might disrupt the chain of authority. Worse, fire, the constant threat of candle and hearth, could destroy the entire rhythm in a night. Monks often practiced fire drills, carrying manuscripts and relics to stone-walled sacristies. Time could vanish in flame. And yet, most monasteries endured for centuries. Their routines outlasted kings, wars, even languages. Because their timekeeping was not built on tools. It was built on discipline, faith, and habit. The candle might falter. The bell might crack. But the monk would still rise, at the hour he could no longer see, but could still feel. Monastic life wasn't timeless. It was saturated in time, slow, deliberate, looping endlessly, like breath. What do we lose when we stop repeating things, when we fill every hour with novelty and abandon the sacred boredom of doing something, simply because it is time? The bell sounds without hands. Gears turn behind a wooden panel. Weights lower. Iron chimes strike the air. The monks gather as they always have, hoods up, sandals scuffing the stone. But something is different. There was no brother watching the candle this time. No custos horologi trimming the wick. Time has been automated. And with this subtle change, The monastery has done something momentous. It has given up a little bit of spiritual control in exchange for mechanical certainty. It is a quiet turning point, one they cannot yet name, but which will echo for centuries. Around the 13th century, the first mechanical clocks emerged in European monasteries and cathedral towers. They used escapement mechanisms to regulate motion weights that descended over time, bells struck by hammers. Not hands, no faces. Only sound. These clocks didn't tell the hour with hands, they rang it. The earliest were built by monks, metalworkers, and astronomers working together. Their purpose was singular: to regulate prayer. In short, monks built machines not to rule time, but to better obey it. As mechanical clocks improved, they spread beyond monasteries. Town halls, universities, and marketplaces installed tower clocks to coordinate trade, bell towers for civic announcements, public clocks visible to all. Suddenly, time was no longer liturgical, it was universal. The canonical hours were still observed, but now people also spoke of quarter past the hour, noon sharp, 2 o'clock. This shift restructured life. Merchants scheduled deliveries, courts set hearings, laborers punched time cards. Eventually, the monastic structure of the day, once cloistered, had been released into the world. For centuries, the monastic bell had rung only for those within earshot of its stone walls. Now, in towns and cities, it rang for bakers, butchers, apprentices, students, traders. Each chime no longer summoned prayer, but productivity. The quiet discipline of the monastery became the loud expectation of society. Be on time, meet the hour, don't be late. In this way, monastic time became modern time. And no one asked the monks for permission. Not all monks embraced the mechanical age. Some feared loss of spiritual attentiveness, dependence on fallible machines, encroachment of secular rhythms. One abbot in 1410 wrote, "The bell that rings itself removes from us the need to watch, to wait, to obey. It trains us not in virtue, but in reflex." Others warned of clocks chiming at incorrect hours, bells ringing during fasts or feast days by mistake, noise replacing intentional listening. Still, most monasteries adopted them because the bells did not forget, fall asleep, or grow weary. But something human had been traded away. In the 16th century, monastic life in England and parts of Europe came to a crashing halt. The dissolution of the monasteries, under Henry VIII, disbanded hundreds of religious houses. Monks were pensioned off or forced into secular life. Libraries were burned or scattered. Bell towers went silent. Candles were no longer lit for lauds. Time was no longer sanctified. In place of prayer, the land now yielded tenant farms, sheep for wool, estate income, and the rhythm of the day, once spiritual, became economic. Yet the structures remained: walls, bells, clocks. Even in ruin, the monastery's memory persisted. The Industrial Revolution did not invent strict time discipline. It inherited it. Factory whistles echoed the monastic bell. Punch clocks echoed the canonical hours. Shift rotations mimicked ora et labora. The difference? Monks chose obedience. Workers were compelled by wages. Monastic boredom sought God. Industrial boredom produced goods. Yet the core habit remained: time as ruler, routine as virtue, measurement as morality. The ghost of the candle still flickered in steel mills and textile halls. By the 19th century, few remembered that candles had once marked the hours. Wax gave way to gas, gas to electricity. Chimes were replaced by ticks, then beeps, then silent phone vibrations. But the monk's logic remained embedded in school schedules, business calendars, hospital rotations, train timetables. We kept the rhythm, even after forgetting the reason. A candle burned for devotion. A clock ticks for efficiency. The feeling of being late, once a spiritual failure, became a social one. The guilt, however, feels the same. The monks did not keep time to control it. They kept it to surrender to it. They lived each hour fully, not because they had to, but because it was the hour, and the hour was holy. They measured time not in profit, but in presence. In the modern world, we countdown, rush through, multitask, escape boredom, but the monks welcomed boredom, not as failure, but as formation. They believed that repeating something every day could make it sacred. Could it still? In every school bell, shift rotation, and morning alarm, there is a faint echo of a monastery candle burning to its mark. We live in times shaped by prayer, even if we now call it productivity. So the next time you're bored, or waiting, or watching the clock. Remember the monk in the scriptorium, repeating the same word, by the same light, for the same reason, because it was time.